In the very heart of this world stretched the central continent, the majestic Arcadia, destined in the future to become the most powerful empire, unmatched by any. Neighboring these blessed lands was the continent of Truvelia, where the most diverse races and monstrous creatures lived side by side. Orcs, who had long hidden in the impenetrable depths of ancient forests, for an unknown reason suddenly united, developed at an incredible speed in a very short time, and began a merciless conquest of the entire continent. Humans, who desperately resisted the green-skinned invaders in a bloody war, only with incredible difficulty managed to hold a fragile victory. Crossan, the legendary hero of that troubled time, led his valiant troops to triumph, training countless knights using his unique method of mana training, unparalleled anywhere else. But as soon as the bloody war ended, greedy aristocrats and envious priests, who had long envied the hero's boundless glory, made a mad decision to exile the celebrated warrior. It seemed that at that fateful moment, the power-hungry aristocrats did not even consider the catastrophic consequences of their reckless act, and it is quite obvious that after very little time the second war unfolded, this time with dragons. The strength of human warriors was no longer what it had been before, for the true hero had left them along with his loyal knights and devoted followers. And again the human race found itself on the very edge of complete extinction, balancing between life and death. In the end, the people of Truvelia, driven into a hopeless corner, had to resort to dubious dark spells of forbidden magic. They summoned from another world a powerful otherworldly entity, which was supposed to replace the exiled hero of former times. And although the battle turned out to be incredibly difficult, and several times more desperate than ever before, the newly emerged hero named Demigod still successfully defeated the bloodthirsty Red Dragon, who unleashed this merciless war. In the end, at the cost of countless victims, the long-awaited victory was still achieved. However, due to its excessive stupidity and short-sightedness, humanity was doomed to step on the same rake again and again, failing to learn lessons from the past. The events shift to the continent of Truvelia, in the remote, dense forests of the Eastern Army. There, on the frozen ground, lay a lifeless warrior whose mutilated body was greedily devoured by flocks of crows. The sinister birds struggled to pull off his heavy helmet. These scavengers had already eaten so much of his flesh that they even managed to peck out the eyes from the empty sockets, leaving only bloody gaps. At that very moment, somewhere in the impenetrable depths of the gloomy forest, a fierce battle between humans and monsters continued. In the end, the warriors still managed to defeat a whole pack of werewolves that suddenly ambushed them. After that, the surviving fighters hurried to get out of the cursed forest. They sensed a fading trace of magic, so they needed to identify the exact location of the princess as soon as possible and protect her. However, suddenly, a frightened warrior called his commander, pointing with a hand, numb from fear, at something terrible visible in the distance near the sinister bushes. When the other fighters cautiously went there, they saw with horror many dead bodies helplessly sprawled on the frozen ground. These corpses were clearly not fresh, already touched by decay, but what frightened the squad captain the most was that he had absolutely no understanding of what exactly had happened to these unfortunate people and how they met their demise. The warlord quickly scanned their mutilated bodies with magic. However, he found no direct traces of the kidnapped princess, to his deep disappointment. Nevertheless, the entire area around these corpses was saturated with incredibly complex dark magic, with chaotic mana vortices and traces of chemicals. Apparently, these fallen warriors were the pitiful remnants of the escort of some important aristocrat carrying a precious cargo. However, unexpectedly, the experienced scout nimbly climbed a tall tree, carefully examining the entire surrounding area. He was convinced such an exquisite level of forbidden magic is not characteristic of Truvelia or any other remote region. Although the perpetrators desperately tried to hide their tracks, most likely Arcadia was involved in this treacherous attack. The strangest thing was that there was not the slightest trace of resistance or struggle on these dead warriors, and this means that most likely the unfortunate ones were subjected to a banal hunt, where they did not even have a single chance for rescue or survival. Of course, Kuslan did not immediately understand what exactly his insightful friend was hinting at, and asked him to explain more clearly. Then the scout recalled exactly how the daring kidnapping of the royal princess had happened quite recently. Still, she was kidnapped as an act of daring rebellion. This crime was committed by the illegitimate son of the Duke, who had completely despaired of gaining recognition. Obviously, this information allowed the captain to quickly understand. This very bastard had entered into a secret conspiracy with the enemy people, betraying his homeland. However, even if we accept as true that the Knights of Arcadia were involved here, it still remained unclear who could have hunted these experienced warriors so mercilessly, leaving them no chance. And to great regret, the experienced scout had only one possible course of events, but far from the most pleasant to hear. Following the fading trail of the princess's magic, the warriors accidentally trespassed into the cursed territory of a monstrous monster. He was an outcast of the dragon race, and one of the most powerful monsters in all of Trevelia. At the same time, this ogre was also the very fiend who captured and mutilated the poor princess, while mercilessly carrying her fragile body from the palace through the night darkness. However, what was also reliably known about this bloodthirsty ogre was that he never, under any circumstances, left his unfortunate prey alive, reveling in the killings. Obviously, everything came together. If the trail of summoning magic ended precisely in this cursed forest, then there was simply no chance of saving the princess. It was a true curse of fate. So the captain needed some time to thoroughly think everything over in his troubled mind and piece it together. But what was extremely strange was that the monster, who never left anyone alive, suddenly hunted here in the dense forest, without leaving a single obvious sign of murder or dismemberment of bodies. Therefore, the commander could only tirelessly pray to all known gods that Princess Leonie was still alive against all odds. Many years later, a small group of merchants cautiously advanced along the winding route of the Peyran Trade Guild. Obviously, many of them were openly panicking, as the sun was rapidly setting beyond the horizon, and they had hopelessly gotten lost in the thicket, which was obviously dangerous, considering that utter darkness was about to fall. Baxter, an experienced caravan guard, carefully analyzed all the space around to detect any lurking danger in advance and prevent disaster. When they were finally lost in the forest thickets, Baxter decided to directly ask Perrin how many times exactly they had traveled this treacherous path before. Obviously, the experienced guard assumed that this was the very first expedition of the merchants. After all, if they had known exactly how winding and dangerous this path was, they would surely have hired many more armed guards. Of course, Perrin desperately tried to calm the worried Baxter. After all, they were not some inexperienced newcomers in the trade business. As is known to wise people, even rivers and mountains change drastically over 10 long years, transforming beyond recognition. At that moment, Baxter's battle comrade approached him, cautiously assuming that the traders were not lying, and the terrain had indeed radically changed under the influence of some external factors. However, suddenly, looking straight at his unsuspecting friend, Baxter hissed warningly through clenched teeth, ordering Tilyuk to step back immediately. Immediately after this grim warning, both guards swiftly armed themselves, and the fastest decisively rushed forward, straight towards the ominous forest thicket. And just then, the first bloodthirsty werewolf appeared, baring its fangs. So Baxter, without wasting a single minute on hesitation, immediately fiercely attacked the creature, and with one powerful blow, cut open its soft belly. But of course, everyone found it extremely strange and frightening that this monster was wearing orc battle armor. So everything indicated that the traders had fallen into a deadly trap. These two experienced guards firmly ordered the frightened merchants not to panic under any circumstances, and to gather as closely together as possible in a group. If they rashly separate from the main group, most likely they will be instantly devoured by lurking creatures, torn to bloody shreds. After that, the entire group of brave guards stood up to protect the defenseless merchants, intently peering into the impenetrable forest, where it was even frightening to guess the exact number of lurking werewolves. Finally, the experienced fighter, now alert, sharply felt the rapid approach of numerous enemies from all sides. A whole hungry pack of armed hyenas in armor fiercely rushed at a small group of guards, consisting of 4 brave men. Each of the warriors distributed responsibility and took on one fierce monster, trying to deal with it as quickly as possible, not allowing the others to break through. However, to great regret, thanks to the sharp claws of one wounded hyena, they still managed to seriously wound Tilyuk in the head, causing his protective helmet to immediately fall off his bloodied head, striking the ground with a clang. Pressing the bleeding spot with his gloved hand, the wounded man immediately plunged his sword deeply into the soft belly of the cursed animal, making it howl in pain. It was clearly visible that Peyran had completely panicked, for although he expected that various monsters could live in the wild forest, these creatures turned out to be too strong and organized for ordinary beasts. And Tilyuk, ignoring the lamentations of this frightened fool, roughly ordered him to be silent immediately and not to interfere with the fight. Obviously, those lying merchants shamelessly lied that the path through the forest was completely safe, and for such a vile setup, they deserved a huge amount of gold as a fine if they did not die here. The leader of the whole group, the experienced Baxter, warned his battle friends and frightened merchants. The monsters still alive are now scared and cowardly, hiding in the shadows of the forest, waiting for a convenient moment. However, suddenly everyone heard a loud, frightened neigh of a horse, tearing the silence. Peyran quickly discovered from which side the noise that scared the horse was coming. So with a trembling hand, he pointed the necessary direction to Baxter, and immediately after that, they saw with horror a huge troll, who, having fed on the slaughter, leisurely emerged from the impenetrable thicket of the ancient forest, shaking the ground. The giant, without hesitation, found a huge mossy stone nearby, lifted it from the frozen ground with his muscular hands, and immediately threw it with all his might at the miserable humans who had boldly trespassed on his territory. To the greatest happiness, the experienced shield-bearer managed to raise his shield in time, miraculously deflecting the crushing blow at the last moment. If the boulder had hit the target, it would have killed the entire crowd of defenseless merchants in one sweep, who were now panic-stricken and huddled into a miserable heap. By this fateful moment, Peyran fully realized the scale of his mistake, but at the same time understood even 10 experienced mercenaries, let alone a whole 100, would hardly be able to kill such a powerful enemy. Baxter, with his last strength, restrained the all-consuming fear, feverishly analyzing the critical situation. The fact that armed werewolves appeared before the mighty troll clearly indicated that they worked as a team and helped the giant hunt humans. The troll was now leisurely looking around and sniffing, which looked as if he was trying to find some other heavy object to throw at the humans. Considering that the monster acted quite skillfully, Baxter assumed some deserters from the army might have secretly been training trolls in the remote forest. This meant that they did not just accidentally fall into a trap on the way. They were being hunted deliberately. However, the most terrible thing was that none of those present could say for sure. Would they even survive this night? The captain of the guard firmly ordered the fighters to gather all the merchants together and protect them to the last breath. At the same time, he asked Tilyuk for help, to distract the troll if it decided to throw something heavy again. Of course, Tilyuk perfectly understood. It was too risky and insane an idea to fight the troll head-on. They could very well just abandon these deceitful merchants to their fate and run. However, it was obvious that Baxter would not have suggested something so risky and reckless if he did not have a well-thought-out plan in mind and in reserve. He suggested to his comrades to find the right moment when the troll would be distracted by something else. Then, they could quickly slip between its massive legs and attack the unprotected spot. Something similar had been done before with Tilyuk on the bloody battlefield more than once, so the maneuver was well practiced. Of course, Tilyuk was extremely frightened and worried. He would sincerely prefer to die here and now, rather than experience that indescribable horror he felt in the war with dragons once again. However, since the captain had already decisively rushed into reckless combat, the ordinary soldier had not much choice, only to follow the commander. The closer Baxter ran up to the giant, the more carefully he looked at the troll itself. And he noticed the troll was not even looking at the approaching warrior. The monster was completely disconnected from what was happening, staring somewhere into the distance. At that tense moment, some monster suddenly appeared from the impenetrable thicket of the forest. Gaining enough speed, it crashed with all its might into the massive troll, and the power of the blow was truly enormous. The monster immediately fell with a crash onto the frozen ground. Of course, Baxter immediately slowed down, desperately trying to understand what exactly happened and who attacked the troll so swiftly. At that very moment, the monster itself began to be seized by convulsions after the received blow. The approaching Tilyuk apparently thought it was the commander who managed to kill this giant with one strike. However, they clearly saw the monster, which now calmly sat atop the carcass of the killed monster. Having dealt with the giant, it got up as if nothing had happened, after which it leisurely headed towards the frightened people. However, it did not even touch them. Instead, the stranger looked around, carefully studying the surrounding area. When he noticed the dead hyenas, he approached one and pulled off a mask resembling a muzzle. And then, most strangely, as if obeying animal instincts, he began to sniff it. Looking at such unusual behavior, no one had any idea what was happening and what this monster was even doing. The only one who understood what was going on was Baxter. The friend obviously did not judge for ignorance, since Tilyuk was a city dweller and therefore had not heard the legends. And although he had lived a long life, he had never encountered anything like this. There was a sinister legend. In this cursed forest lived the fiercest monster of all existing. They say if you meet it, a person will not get out alive, and these very terrifying monsters were considered ogres. Now, looking at the monster in front of him, no one believed their own eyes. After all, there were only a few ogres in the whole world. However, among other creatures, they had no equals not only in agility and strength, but also in sharp mind and predator's persistence. Of course, Baxter could not even imagine that he would encounter a creature he had only heard about in scary stories. At that moment, the merchants completely panicked, not understanding why the mercenaries stood frozen like statues before the monster. The thing was that Baxter simply did not know what to do, try to run away or not resist at all. However, it seemed that even if he ran, he would in any case become a snack for this creature. But the most amazing thing was that, looking at the people, the ogre thought about something and nodded calmly. After that, he extended his hand to Baxter. After all, he saw how hard the fight had been for him. Therefore, he asked the people not to be afraid, because he could lead them from the forest to the city. He hoped that the people would not fear him, because despite his appearance, he was of the same blood as the people. After that, the ogre introduced himself. His name was Leon, and he was a half-blood, a human and an ogre. It turned out they had wandered to the southeast of Trevelia, into the kingdom of Arnia, which bordered Helprane. It was here, in a remote forest, that their village Perron was located. The overseer carefully looked around from the tower towards the forest, so that in case anything happened, he would immediately notice if someone came. And the one who came was Leon, whom the watchman at first did not immediately recognize. Following Leon, merchants came out of the forest, stretching their stiff bodies after a long journey, rejoicing that they had managed to avoid death. The head of the trade guard carefully looked at the huge fences surrounding the village. This fence was clearly made to fight monsters. Finally, seeing the gathering of people, the watchman recognized Leon, surprised. He had been missing for several days. The young man calmly greeted his old friend and explained that he had brought merchants who had delivered goods to their village. These merchants got lost, and Leon found them while gathering firewood. And as far as he knew, the merchants had an appointment with the elder. And although the overseer believed his friend's words, no one had warned him about a visit at such a late hour. Moreover, he was worried. These could be bandits pretending to be merchants. Of course, Perrin got angry that they were suspected of such things and hastily explained. They got lost in the forest because they deviated from the path drawn by the elder. From these words, the guards traveling with them quickly realized Perrin lied to them. He really was walking this trail for the first time. But in any case, the overseer in the watchtower needed proof that these people were merchants. Otherwise, they could be sent away. He was not going to risk the village's safety. Of course, Perrin immediately shouted, demanding that the village elder be called to him. At the same time, Leon sighed heavily, rubbing his head aching from the man's shouting. In the end, he tried to explain. For the village's safety, these people were exactly what they needed. After all, he had recently heard troubling rumors from deep in the forest that someone had tampered with the road, so the help of these people was very timely. Besides, he saw no reason to worry. If these people really brought trouble, he could always beat them up. In the end, thanks to these words, they were still allowed through. However, the entire people froze in fear in an instant. Fortunately, when they were let inside, they were finally able to rest. Stopping in the village of Perron, the elder, upon hearing the story of the merchant Perron, just laughed, not believing. Leon really threatened the merchants that, if anything happened, he would beat them. After all, as was known, Leon was a true kind-hearted man. Only then did Perrin finally calm down, and was very glad that he managed not to perish and to reach the village safe and sound. The only ones who suffered were the mercenaries, which was very unfortunate. Baxter decided to ask about the barricades that surrounded the entire village. Of course, he understood that the village was located in a remote forest where monsters often appeared. However, these measures still seemed too harsh. Baxter understood that he might be wrong, but the village looked as if it was preparing for war, and to his surprise, the village elder fell silent, only calmly bowing his head to the ground. Even Leon was surprised. After all, he had never heard the word war. At the same time, Perrin was indignant at Baxter, because he was too persistent a guy who always needed to get to the truth. At that moment, the old man carefully examined those who had come to him and realized Baxter was a representative of combat mercenaries, possibly connected to Kincaid. But with a smile, he explained to the visitors that war was a terrible thing. In his years, the war was an attempt to escape from the clutches of orcs who enslaved humans, but by uniting, humans still managed to carry out a sacred revolution. For this reason, the man now believed that wars were only unnecessary destruction and bloodshed for selfish purposes. Leon, however, had no idea what war was. However, from the village elder's story, it really sounded terrible. The elder himself very much hoped that such a tragedy would bypass their village. After all, this village was built on the sincere desires of the people. However, unexpectedly, Tilyuk stepped forward and loudly struck his glass on the table. He felt that the elder was engaging in useless sophistry, talking about the sincere desires of the people. In essence, they were just using a convenient cover to hide the real weapon of war. Of course, he could understand that the barricades looked harmless and protected their village. However, Leon was a very dangerous being. Even though he spoke humanly, Tilyuk had never in his life met anyone who could crush a troll with bare hands like a nut. However, it seemed the villagers did not understand. A threat had crept in far more serious than war. Obviously, for someone like them, the war with Kincaid was a very painful topic. Therefore, the guard needed proof that Leon was not a weapon, and that this creepy half-blood existed in a single copy. Obviously, even the other warriors and merchants somehow treated Tilyuk with contempt. After all, calling Leon creepy was a bit strange. Even Baxter thought that his comrade was clearly overdoing it by treating Leon, who had helped them, that way. Leon himself, having listened to these people, only calmly nodded. Because of his naivety, he did not understand at all what people were so strongly opposed to. However, he perfectly understood that they could not accept him. He hoped that he could prove he posed no threat. Perhaps then these people would leave and not spread rumors that their village was dangerous. And fortunately, the ogre had a way to convince them otherwise, so he suggested that Tiluk talk with his mother. Soon, they went outside and entered a distant house located deep in the village. There sat a white-haired woman at a covered table reading a book. While they were approaching the house, Tiluk felt a somewhat unpleasant smell. It turned out to be the smell of Leon's urine, which he had sprayed around because it repelled monsters. Finally, having reached the house, the hero knocked on the door, warning his mother of his arrival, after which he carefully slipped through the doorway. He apologized for being late, implying that he had some important matters in the village. Tiluk immediately began to peer in, trying to find out what kind of woman was in the house. However, how low his jaw dropped when he saw Madame sitting there. The golden-haired beauty herself greeted her dear son upon his return. The events moved back many years. Then some commotion began at the watchtower of the village Perron, and the village elder hurried there. It turned out the caretaker discovered something behind the barricades, so the elder ordered them to report the situation. No one yet fully understood the obvious reason for what had happened. It turned out that some ogre had come to their walls, whom the village elder could barely make out. However, when he saw his eyes, everything became clear in an instant. Of course, the headman was quite frightened, as were all the others in the village. However, they could not attack, so the elder ordered everyone to immediately lay down their weapons, lie low, and not provoke this creature. After all, the elder, having lived many years, had clearly seen this monster in the book about monsters. It was the forest wolf, the legend of Trevelia, the main killer of the continent. Or this monster was called Lobo. Of course, the old man did not understand why, out of all possible places, this most dangerous creature in the world appeared to them specifically. This ogre was capable of jumping over any barricade, so perhaps they would need siege weapons. The overseers clearly understood that Lobo's arrival here was not the most surprising thing happening. They had been observing this legendary predator for quite some time, and it behaved extremely strangely for a bloodthirsty monster. For several long hours, it simply stood motionless, like a stone statue. Of course, the village elder did not expect to hear anything like that, and the guards desperately tried to interrogate the old man. Was it said in that ancient book about monsters that perhaps the ogre needed something else besides bloody hunting? However, nothing of the sort was recalled. Therefore, the elder cautiously looked around the fence again, watching their unexpected guest. He could not even imagine what this fierce creature from legends might need. However, catching the elder's gaze, he immediately pointed with his clawed paw at something near his massive legs. It was a bundle of fabric in which the very Princess Leonie was carefully wrapped. Right after that, he turned around and hurriedly left the village forever, disappearing into the forest thickets. The wardens watched cautiously for a long time in the direction where the mighty ogre had galloped off, to make sure he would not return for the prey. And looking down at the ground, they saw with amazement a man lying near their gates. And when they noticed that the woman's hands trembled slightly, they quickly realized she was still alive. This woman was now, at the present time, in a hut outside the village waiting for her son. When Leon entered the cozy room, he saw that his mother had prepared his favorite cheese and fried ham. The mother tenderly gave her son a spoon so that he could eat his fill, and the others, watching the half-blood sit down at the table, stood like statues, not knowing what to say from the shock. Leonie immediately apologized to these people that they had traveled such a long way, and she did not even have anything to properly feed them. If her son had warned her in advance of their arrival, this unfortunate misunderstanding would not have happened. However, he hurried to explain to his mother that bringing these people was a rather spontaneous decision made on the go. The woman herself, looking carefully at the torn clothes of the arriving people, understood. They had come after a long and difficult journey. She even thought that her son might have accidentally harmed them, so she promised to scold her son for it. However, Leonie was genuinely curious to find out. Why had they come here at such a late hour? The men stood for a long time, mouths agape, staring at Leonie with wide eyes. The first thing Tiluk noticed was her refined accent, so everyone immediately began to guess where this mysterious woman was from. After all, Only influential aristocrats and members of the royal family spoke with such a noble accent. Therefore, obviously, the first thing Tilyuk thought was that the inhabitants of this disgusting village had brought a prisoner here against her will. Leonie only sighed heavily, having understood everything from just one suspicious look from Tilyuk. She already suspected why he had come here. Moreover, whatever they heard from him would surely blow up into a real, loud scandal. Leonie immediately apologized for her son's inappropriate behavior, promising such a thing would not happen again. She did not know exactly what these people wanted to hear from her, so that they could finally leave her alone. Of course, Baxter immediately noticed her words sounded almost like veiled blackmail. However, Leonie ignored this remark. Noticing their distinctive marks, she realized the visitors were members of the trade guild. It seemed that in this case, they could easily come to an agreement on everything. Tilyuk, of course, immediately protested, making it clear to his leader they had nothing to discuss with these people. No matter the circumstances, he, being a member of Kincaid, had to find out the truth at any cost. Baxter decisively silenced his unrestrained friend and calmly explained to Leonie her son saved them from certain death. Therefore, they agreed not to mention anything about what happened in the forest. However, Tilyuk still did not understand why a person like Leonia continued to stubbornly hide in the wilderness. Moreover, he urgently needed to know the reason why she bore and gave birth to this vile half-blood. Of course, the woman made it clear the guy crosses all possible boundaries while in her house. However, he simply could not believe that the woman was so pathetic. She hides her existence in such a wilderness and simply doesn't have the strength to look at the chaos of the outside world. After all, even now, somewhere on the battlefield, their people are being cut down like cattle. By this time, the boundless thirst for conquest had inevitably reached even the demonic races. Tilyuk would never be able to forget what these bloodthirsty demons did just to take a tiny piece of land for themselves. And now, he even met a disgusting half-blood in this god-forsaken wilderness. In his opinion, it would be much better to look at the valiant shield-bearers of Helprine than at these miserable people hiding from the world, and no longer able to listen to these insulting words. Even the patient Baxter firmly ordered his friend to be silent immediately. However, ignoring the comrade's words, Tilyuk decided to find out directly. What exactly does their village hide behind its high barricades? And most importantly, he was eager to know, why did a woman of such high status so calmly accept the monster's seed? And although Leonie perfectly understood the doubts and righteous indignation of the young man, she categorically did not want to talk about these painful things. Looking at the worsening condition of his beloved mother, Leon panicked greatly and rushed to help her, but Tilyuk would not calm down, demanding explanations from the woman. Why did she accept this monstrous choice and now carry this disgusting hybrid? Seeing how these cruel words continued to rapidly worsen his mother's condition, the half-blood could no longer endure the tension. Leonie perfectly understood how this dangerous conflict could end. However, it was already too late. The ogre raised his powerful hand and gave a ringing slap to this insolent man. He flew off at such an incredible speed that he even broke through all the walls of the house they were in. And when the half-blood looked at his hand, it was covered in the blood of the man he had struck. He himself did not understand what monstrous force he had put into that blow, and obviously panicked greatly upon realizing what he had done. At that very moment, Leonie fell to the ground in fright, begging her little son to calm down and regain his composure. At the same time, Tilyuk, who was struck by the hero, was already lying on the street on the cold ground, choking on his own blood. His loyal comrade Baxter stood up to defend him, decisively arming himself with his battle sword. Obviously, the young half-blood immediately rushed to his mother, trying to lift her up in fear, and Baxter could not leave them alone, and immediately approached the ogre with his blade ready. Seeing this, he immediately panicked and began desperately begging that this man not touch his poor mother. However, this formidable blade was originally aimed not at the woman at all. According to Baxter, this sword was meant to kill the one who did not even look like a human, after which he rushed forward attacking the enemy. Of course, the frightened Leonie immediately screamed, trying to get up and shield her son with her body, begging him not to lose control and come to his senses. Baxter hurried to calm the woman. She should not worry. He would not inflict fatal wounds on the youth. He only wanted to subdue him. However, when he turned around, he realized it seemed he had drawn his sword in vain. At this fateful moment, the half-blood finally lost control over his human nature and completely gave himself over to the wild instincts of the ogre. And moreover, at that moment, his mighty body began to rapidly regenerate. So there was not the slightest trace or scar left from the man's blow. In principle, it was not surprising that the wound healed so quickly. After all, the young man was partly an ogre. This meant that weak attacks could not harm or cause him pain. At that tense moment, Baxter noticed that the paw aimed at Leon was moving in the direction where his mother lay. He was already afraid that the boy had lost his mind so much that he would now harm Leon too. But instead, grabbing the man by the cloak, he immediately threw him out of his house with one motion. Right after that, he jumped out after him, landing heavily on the cold night ground. By the time the predator raised his head, Baxter was already firmly standing on his feet. He realized the guy, even in a state of beastly madness, was cunning enough. Apparently, he preferred open space, more suitable for his large body to maneuver. As a result, a fierce fight broke out between the two. The warrior avoided enemy attacks in every way, dodging claws. However, during the battle, he began to understand. It seemed the young man chose open space because he was afraid that his powerful movements might harm his mother in a confined space. In the end, no matter how much he attacked the young ogre, he could not touch or wound him. Only later did the experienced warrior notice. He did not hit Leon because he perfectly copied all his moves. Like a mirror, the mystery remained. How did he manage to learn this sophisticated technique in such a short time? At that moment, Tilyuk, having come to his senses, looked back at his comrade in battle, deeply worried about him. This was not surprising, considering how fierce the battle was being fought right behind his back. However, at that moment, Leonie herself came up to Tilyuk, leaning on her reliable crutch. She only looked at the young man with contempt. After all, if he had behaved like a human, not like an aggressive beast, this would not have happened at all. In the end, after another attack, the half-blood began to gradually come to his senses, regaining reason. Baxter, frankly speaking, was amazed by the incredible abilities of the young monster. He copied all his movements after seeing them only once, and even developed the perfect countermeasure. And all this was in the berserker's unconscious state, in a frenzy of rage. If it were not for the protective pendant that Baxter had with him, the boy would surely have killed him on the spot with one blow. But still, it seemed incredible that such a small item could control a fierce ogre. It turns out, this pendant was given to Baxter by Leon herself, who found the only remedy capable of calming her son's raging soul. However, the warrior warned, as a member of Kincaid, he had no choice but to tell everything. He had to reveal to the world about the dangerous half-blood monster who risks becoming a weapon of war. But still, he promised that he would not tell anyone anything. He was encountering such an interesting monster for the first time and might overdo it, for which he offered his sincere apologies. Still, he realized Leon was just a child in the form of a monster, but at the same time, he was sane and well-mannered. And for saving them and his mother, Baxter promised to keep his mouth shut. At that very moment, the most frightened Leon heard the comforting voice of his mother behind him. She stood with open arms, calling him to her, for it was already time to rest. The late night was outside. Of course, the young man immediately approached and embraced his mother tightly. He, unable to hold back, wept bitterly. It seemed he himself was frightened by the monstrous power he possessed. And Tilyuk, lying on the ground, still could not come to his senses. Despite the sharp pain in his body, he still continued to lie there and curse this village and its inhabitants, who hid such dangerous secrets from the world. By morning, the hut was already whole and unharmed, as if untouched by destruction, and Leonie was carefully preparing lunch for her son, leaning on her reliable crutch. In the end, the table was set truly luxuriously. It was adorned with a variety of dishes, and the woman herself kept anxiously glancing out the window, waiting for her boy to finally come home. At the same time, Leon was somewhere in the impenetrable thickets of the forest. The young man was leading the merchants, showing them a safer path to civilization. Mr. Perrin was a little indignant. After all, the return road turned out to be even more difficult and confusing than the original route. Even Baxter himself thought that the half-blood was trying too hard to avoid the slightest dangers, choosing an incredibly long detour. However, he hastened to explain, they were taking the detour not only for safety. After all, thanks to his ogre nature, he could listen to the mysterious voice of the forest itself. However, what this ancient forest whispered in his ear, the young ogre preferred not to voice for now. He only led the people further, and promised that they would soon get out of the thicket, and there the path would become much easier and safer. But still, the travelers were puzzled by the boy's excessive caution. However, no one dared to contradict the guide, so everyone obediently followed him along the winding path. The merchants also kept nervously glancing back at the wounded Tilyuk, whom they were carrying on their weary backs. After all, he had foolishly provoked an enraged ogre, but fortunately, they managed to sell a significant portion of the goods, so the load became much lighter, and carrying it was less burdensome. However, the porters sarcastically reminded the fighter that transporting his wounded body should also be generously compensated from his personal purse. Leon himself calmly walked ahead, making his way through the thickets. He was thinking about many things when suddenly Mr. Baxter approached him. From his emaciated face alone, the ogre immediately understood that this man was clearly having a hard time walking such a thorny path. The half-blood sincerely apologized for not thinking of this beforehand. After all, he had walked this beast trail many times and was long accustomed to it. However, the young man promised that very soon they would get out of the forest wilderness, as the scent of his native village was growing closer and clearer. Of course, the merchant was pleased with this comforting news. He was already quite tired from the endless marches. However, Baxter was much more concerned about the young man's exhausted condition. After all, he had been on his feet since night. He had to personally repair the hut destroyed in the fight. However, Leon was not troubled at all by physical fatigue. Throughout the long journey, he continued to think ecstatically about the adventures Peiren had told him about, and about distant cities, of which he had only a vague idea from their enticing scents. For the travelers, it was astonishing that the young ogre had never heard anything like it before. However, it soon became clear that the villagers deliberately avoided such stories in his presence, and even his mother preferred to remain silent about the outside world. Peiren perfectly understood their cautious position. They simply did not want the naive child to be exposed to the harmful temptation of the cruel outside world. However, the merchant believed that it was precisely harsh hardships and deprivations that truly made people hardened and resilient. Leon only smiled gratefully in response, explaining that Peiren's success story also incredibly appealed to him. Especially thrilling was the journey from a poor street trader to a prosperous merchant who sold all his goods. Therefore, the half-blood was extremely curious. Would he be able to achieve the same dizzying success himself? Would he have the necessary grit to survive in the ruthless city? In the end, Baxter decided to take a risk and ask directly why the boy had never been beyond the borders of his native village. The warrior was worried that the stubborn elder simply would not let him go beyond the barricades. However, the matter was not at all about this. The outside world always enticed the young man with its unexplored mysteries, but staying here was his own conscious choice. Sometimes it seemed to him that the strong barricade of the village was built precisely because of him, not because the villagers watched over and protected him. Simply beyond these walls, no one will meet someone like him with open arms. And besides, obviously, Leon did not want to leave his poor mother all alone. After a difficult childbirth, she began to walk very poorly, which in principle is not surprising given her condition. Moreover, although Leonie never showed it, the locals knew perfectly well that she was of noble royal blood. So even the ogre himself still couldn't understand how his mother ended up in these God-forsaken lands. Obviously, Leon blamed only himself for this, believing that his mother had to give up her high status and privileges for his sake alone. Therefore, he simply could not leave and live as he pleased, forgetting about his duty. Moreover, living side by side with people, he also learned a lot. Before, he only dreamed of fresh, raw flesh, like some wild, untamed ogre from legends. Having heard this sad story, Baxter remembered their very first meeting deep in the forest. He became curious. Had anyone warned the young man in advance that the trading caravan was approaching these parts? However, he hastily assured Baxter it really was just a coincidence. However, his nervous agitation betrayed the not very plausible lie. Reflecting on this, Peyran clearly understood. Although not everyone here appreciated that Leon heroically saved their lives, if they were driven by some secret motives, it was better to honestly talk about it right away. Therefore, the frightened ogre finally had to explain that their meeting had nothing to do with the bloody war and was not something sinister. Still, in the dense forest near the village, a dangerous band of wild orc bandits was hiding. As is customary for orcs by their wild nature, they traveled in a close-knit group. There were not many of them, but still enough to pose a serious threat to lone traders or small mercenary squads. Of course, they did not pose a mortal danger to the most fortified village itself. But it would be far worse if these bandits cut off the vital supply deliveries to the settlement. So Baxter finally understood the true picture. Leon deliberately kept everything in the strictest secrecy. Moreover, he marked his territory around the village so that monsters would not recklessly wander there. However, one fine day the orcs and the trail suddenly vanished without a trace. The young man believed that the matter could be in strengthening the village's defensive walls or increasing the patrol. But still, no matter how much he tried to explain it rationally, it seemed obvious. When he grew up and matured, his formidable presence as a forest ogre caused panic and fear among the other monsters inhabiting this thicket. From this entire frank story, Baxter could draw only one obvious conclusion. The young man selflessly protected travelers for the sake of his fragile reputation in the village. However, this was not entirely true. More precisely, it was not the only reason for his vigilance. Still, in recent troubling times, the orcs began to behave extremely strangely. They tamed gnolls, those very fierce werewolves, and even methodically changed the usual forest landscape. In the mysterious voice of the forest itself, anxious notes of growing panic were constantly heard. However, Leon asked those who came not to worry too much about it. He was firmly convinced that everything would be fine. After all, such things had happened far from the first time. In the worst case, if something serious did happen, he himself would be able to deal with this threat. Just as his detailed story ended, they finally reached the city gates. So Leon warmly thanked the merchants who bravely endured this thorny path through the dangerous forest. At parting, Peyran only sincerely thanked the half-blood for watching over them all this difficult time. This unexpected meeting meant a lot to him. It was especially important for Peyran himself, because now he owed his very life to a representative of a completely different species. And the merchant very much hoped that the boy's cherished dream of exploring the big world would still come true someday. Of course, in the ogre's gaze, it was clearly visible that he doubted these rosy prospects a little. However, the merchant encouragingly asked him not to worry. After all, his first tentative steps into the outside world might turn out to be even easier than he imagined. Once Peyran met a colorful troupe of traveling performers, and there were all sorts of people. They proudly called themselves Circus Noose, traveled around the world, and earned good money from their shows. The experienced defender of the transport company was quite surprised that Peyran was interested in such common folk performances, for he had heard ill rumors that the leader of this circus was not the most sane showman. In the end, everyone good-naturedly laughed at the dreamy Peyran, and it was time to part ways for good. Leon only warmly said goodbye to his old friends, waving to them kindly. After that, he turned back toward the dense trees from where he came and silently prayed fervently that everything would be well with the village. Immediately after this, Leon suddenly became alert, anxiously staring into the impenetrable forest distance. And without thinking long, he swiftly jumped back into the thickest thicket of this dense forest. Then the boy involuntarily recalled events from 8 years ago. At that time, he, together with one of the kind villagers, was watching the pigs grazing on the outskirts of the village. Then this man decided out of curiosity to find out how old the boy had turned this year. Leon, who still couldn't speak properly, hesitantly showed 5 years on his fingers. So, obviously, the man sincerely admired how big and tall this little boy already was. However, then he gently tousled his shaggy head, noticing with a smirk, the boy was far too big for an ordinary 5-year-old. He should eat less, or else he already looked 10 years old. At the very same time, Leone was already cutting fresh pork for dinner, and the man, who was vigilantly watching over the herd, gently ruffled Leon's hair again. Looking at this unusual boy, he involuntarily recalled his own sorrowful childhood, when he irretrievably lost his family, his native home, and everything he had because of a greedy lord and his cruel knights. He desperately fled into the dangerous wild forest. At that time, he was just a tiny child, wandering aimlessly through the thicket for a long time until he accidentally came across a cozy forest clearing. Thus, he unexpectedly stumbled upon the village of Perron. Hearing this sad, heart-wrenching story, Leon immediately tenderly hugged the man, desperately trying to comfort him, and he, thoughtfully looking at the kind boy, perfectly understood, both for his own family and for himself in the past, this modest village had become the only saving place where they could find the long-awaited refuge. Perhaps the reason was that all the local residents shared the same unbearable pain of loss. Soon, recalling these touching moments, the ogre finally returned home. However, he saw with horror how his entire native village was mercilessly blazing in a furious fire. However, there were no obvious signs of monsters nearby even felt. Because of this, the young man suddenly panicked, anxiously remembering his beloved mother was in the village. However, listening to the surrounding sounds, he realized with relief the flames had not yet reached their house. The half-blood immediately began to cautiously look around towards the forest from where the ominous flames came. Unfortunately, it was not just the smell of ordinary fire coming from there. Someone had deliberately set a bonfire and thrown fragrant incense into it. Perhaps they were desperately trying to hide the true smell coming from the burning village. Of course, the ogre was eager to know who was behind this atrocity, and why did they mercilessly set fire to the peaceful village? But first, Leon needed to hurry to save everyone who was still alive. But at that tense moment, he heard a faint, familiar voice behind his broad back and quickly turned around. It was the very same Uncle Nelson with whom he had spent his entire peaceful childhood. And now he was badly wounded in the shoulder, had lost a leg, and was bleeding heavily. Of course, Leon immediately ran to the dying man, desperately trying to help him. However, he fully understood. He did not have much time left in this cruel world. The frightened ogre, panicking and sobbing uncontrollably, promised that he would immediately take Uncle to the village and definitely heal his wounds there. Nelson himself was glad that the boy had arrived not too late. He asked him to urgently go to the village, but strictly warned, whatever he saw there, he must definitely keep his sanity. With these last words, he finally lost all his strength, after which he irreversibly died from a monstrous loss of blood. Leon sat over his lifeless body for an unknown amount of time before finally realizing he needed to go search for other survivors in this hell. However, memories of a carefree childhood and kind Uncle Nelson did not allow him to think rationally. Hot tears treacherously welled up in the young man's eyes. However, he still had not completely lost his reason. At this tense moment, the archers continued their furious barrage, aiming behind the fortified barricades of the village. It turned out that a large-scale assault of various monsters coming out of the dense forest was underway against the peaceful village of Perron. They even dragged siege ladders with them to climb the high walls to the defenders. Therefore, the commander leading the warriors instantly ordered everyone to prepare and open fire. First of all, They needed to shoot at the trolls who were raising heavy ladders to the fortifications. However, despite the captain desperately trying to hold on, he was extremely agitated. He could not understand where such impressive military training came from for a handful of primitive orcs. Who taught them this art of siege? But suddenly, the watch scout saw something extremely strange in the rear of the enemy army. There was a formidable horseman who had saddled a huge, fierce hyena and held a spear resembling a cross in his muscular hands. Judging by the impressive size of this monster, he did not quite resemble an ordinary ogre. Moreover, until that moment, they had never encountered monsters that managed to tame a wolf beast. Only the captain managed to identify the creature that had arrived as an uruk, a rare variety of orcs from distant wastelands. Such seemed to be found on the battlefields of Truvelia, but they could not possibly be here in this wilderness. The commander quickly informed the guys that this was not just another raid of wild orcs. However, suddenly, while he was talking to them, one of the fighters was struck dead by a spear. It was the very spear held by that Uruk horseman. A human head was tied to the end of the shaft, and some kind of letter was also attached. While everyone panicked, desperately trying to stop the bleeding of the wounded comrade, the captain fearfully looked back behind the fortress wall. He saw an enraged Uruk who could not wait for those little bastards to finally come out to meet him. Meanwhile, the assault continued with the same fury. So the commander decisively ordered everyone to first aim at the siege ladders. They must not allow the enemy to climb over their defensive walls, for that would mean inevitable defeat. As a result, the archers immediately began a massive barrage on the enemy, while the spearmen fiercely threw down monsters, trying to break through the mighty gates. The assistant of the leader observing this massacre was struck by how people were taking down their brave fighters. He made his leader Uluk understand. As long as he had observed the miserable people, he had not seen such power for a long time. At that very moment, the captain himself took his reliable crossbow and aimed at the enemy. In the end, Uluk's close advisor was killed by a precise arrow shot straight to the head, and the enraged Uluk lost his temper even more, raging at those damned people. At that moment, he, turning on his beast, gave a formidable signal to his army of monsters to attack, and the warriors, who finally helped the wounded friend, carefully untied the mysterious letter from the blood-stained staff. However, the message was written in the Orc language, which was unknown to them. When Uluk stepped back, the orcs began to lead someone bound with heavy chains. Then the onlookers could horrifiedly make out 3 people who had weakly dragged themselves behind them in chains. However, before their commander noticed them in the distance, he ordered the archers to prepare a massive volley of fire on signal. The benevolent observer hastily stopped him when he suddenly recognized their younger warriors who had previously gone on reconnaissance. Of course, if they had started firing, they would have killed their own brothers, along with the monsters. Therefore, the captain immediately ordered the troops to cease fire. After all, these vile monsters were using their people as a human shield. At that moment, the enemies, placing the captives in front of them, began to gradually and confidently advance towards the massive gates. Of course, everyone panicked, not understanding. Where did the monsters get this trio from? Where did they manage to capture their people? However, there was no time to delay. The enemies were sneaking towards the barricades. Therefore, the warriors persistently urged the captain to make a decision before it was too late. First of all, he sent his loyal spearmen into battle. They, descending from the wall, held the gates to prevent the monsters from breaking inside by force. Everyone understood perfectly. If they broke through, the inevitable end would come to all the villagers. So the defenders were ready to stand to the death. Only one young lad cowardly sat trembling behind the sandbags. So the commander angrily scolded him. There was no time for fear. The gates had to be sealed immediately. However, the boy could do nothing about his terror. He only trembled with chilling fear, not understanding why he was surrounded by such fools. Of course, they fought monsters many times, but there had never been such a large-scale attack. Fighting was pointless, because the monsters came here for a specific reason, and they will get what they want at any cost. At that very moment, they had already prepared their mighty battering ram, with which they began mercilessly pounding the fortified gates. The warriors held on desperately, but their strength rapidly left them with each new crushing blow. The monsters, however, who were extremely determined, clearly understood they would soon manage to break inside. Moreover, they were convinced Uluk did not lie to them. He was truly a hardened monster in battle. Therefore, those who decided to help him agreed to keep their promise and assist with his bloody hunt. The prisoners at that time simply lowered their eyes to the ground, having no strength to look at the unfolding nightmare, but everyone expected at least some decisive order from the captain. However, he could do nothing, for he continued to look at his son among the prisoners, and everyone obviously understood his unbearable pain. He hesitated because of his own son. However, they had no way to help him. If they start firing now, a tragedy will occur, so they simply had no choice. In the end, the man with a heavy heart ordered everyone to open fire. However, he warned that he himself would not be able to shoot together with them. The fighters apologetically excused themselves to the captain, preparing for the deadly barrage. But Uluk only laughed contemptuously at the weakness of these miserable people, for he clearly saw the guilt tormenting their faces. However, before the volley occurred, Leon swiftly appeared on the battlefield with his mighty axe. Immediately after that, he landed heavily right behind the monsters, blocking their further path. Uluk was clearly pleased that this ogre spawn had finally shown itself. However, at the very moment the half-blood landed, he immediately took several monster lives with one sweeping blow. Of course, everyone was on alert when Leon appeared on the battlefield. At that very moment, the orcs turned to their leader to understand. What should they do now? Their prey swallowed the bait. So the time came for the next treacherous step. This also meant they no longer needed the hostages. So Uluk instantly attacked the villager Derek, mortally wounding the young man in the chest. At the last moment, he looked at his appearing friend, who stood like a pillar, not believing that all this was happening in reality. However, the lifeless body of the comrade left no doubt. Those who dared to come with war had truly mercilessly killed him. At the same time, Uluk looked far too self-satisfied for someone who had so senselessly taken someone's life. Obviously, Leon immediately lost control of himself in righteous anger and instantly rushed to attack the intruder. The latter wielded his blade in every possible way, trying to somehow hit the opponent, but unsuccessfully. During the fierce battle, the orc quickly realized the boy possessed the technique of a knightly order and was capable of many tricks. But due to Leon's inexperience, Uluk still managed to wound him in the stomach and throw him back. But even after such a painful wound, he still landed firmly on his feet, not allowing himself to fall, after which he examined his bleeding wound, waiting for the ogre's blood to begin healing it. Even Uluk, looking at the youth, understood he had not dealt him a strong enough blow. And this was his deadly attack, meant to cut even an ogre in half. After that, the self-satisfied monster mockingly decided to ask the hero, how does it feel to receive such a serious wound for the first time? Surely it was unbearably painful. Or perhaps he was simply in shock from the speed of his own regeneration. However, when Leon did not respond to his provocative words, Uluk finally went mad. Thinking the boy had lost his tongue, but ignoring all his useless shouts, the half-blood immediately rushed into battle with renewed strength. He finally began to fight, obeying only his wild instincts. In the end, with a single precise attack, he managed to knock the mighty Uluk off his feet, and looking at the panting opponent, he finally realized the true strength, agility, and talent of his enemy. Obviously, some miserable thug could never compare to a real ogre. However, fortunately, he had prepared something else for this case, so the monsters lying in ambush immediately began to envelop the hero with their spiked chains. Moreover, these chains dug deeper into his living flesh with every movement. So even powerful regeneration could not help here. After that, they began to bind him by his arms and legs, every part of his body. And of course, caught in this treacherous trap, Leon could only weakly growl in pain. The approaching Uluk triumphantly explained it was an orcish trap, from which even a troll could not escape. However, obviously, no one expected that this would be enough to deal with Leon forever. But Uluk was pleased by how the boy was suffering now. However, he warned the prisoner. He still had much to endure in his miserable life. After that, Uluk left and led the remaining prisoners with him. Looking at these miserable people, Uruk could conclude the ogre was very different from his wild kin. Unfortunately, he became an obedient little beast for the miserable creatures called humans. Therefore, he decided to mercilessly kill them right before Leon's eyes. Of course, seeing the suffering of his comrades, he immediately trembled, desperately trying to come to their aid. However, the cursed trap cruelly restrained him. Uluk perfectly understood how unpleasant it was for a half-blood to watch his masters die a miserable death. Obviously, Urk knew very well. Leon, even possessing the strength of a wild beast, would never get rid of his weakness before humans. Immediately after these mocking words, he brought another person forward to also kill him in front of the bound hero. Right after that, the monsters holding the chains immediately tightened them to cause the ogre unprecedented pain. Watching his suffering, Uluk only laughed contemptuously, explaining to the young man he would root out his insignificant human core. In the end, only the monster's shell would remain in him. However, the ogre was no longer allowed to let this scoundrel commit lawlessness. Leon jerked, and despite the hellish pain, tore off Uluk's hand with which he held his spear. Immediately after that, the hero himself took the weapon, and despite the intense pain, he firmly stood on his feet. All because until the last moment he remembered his uncle's words, his request that the boy keep himself together no matter what he saw in the village. Looking at the fury with which he defended his friends, Uluk was convinced of the vicissitudes of nature. After all, it was originally embedded in the ogres. The stronger the smell of human blood became, the more furious and uncontrollable these beasts became. Frightened, Leon denied this cruel truth. Leon desperately wanted to understand. Why did this orc come here and create all this madness? However, he only laughed ominously in response, drawing the hero's attention to the trembling rising from the very depths of his wounded soul. Now the smell of orc and human strangely mixed simultaneously in his blood. Uluk did all this exclusively to awaken the true wild ogre. After all, he himself, like Leon, was a despicable half-blood, rejected by both worlds. Watching the battle below, the archers still cautiously remained on the walls. But unfortunately, they didn't hear a single word about what these two were fiercely talking about between themselves. Uluk himself admitted with a bitter smile. He had never even imagined before that in such a god-forsaken place, a half-blood ogre was growing, the offspring of the most formidable monster in the whole world. Moreover, he found it quite amusing that Leon had never wondered why no one had come for his soul with revenge yet. After all, such monsters do not remain unpunished forever. Looking at these two opponents, the observers involuntarily recalled the grim nature of the wasteland orcs. They came from the once sacred battlefield of the interracial conflict. These were the barren, scorched lands of Truvelia. It was here that the mercenary half-breeds, descendants of orcs and humans, became famous. They inherited the strongest traits of both these races, distinguished by unparalleled mastery of weaponry, impeccable teamwork, and even skillful guerrilla warfare. However, they could reproduce only with the help of a lost magical method from ancient times. Therefore, there were very few of them. Each was a true rarity. As soon as the bloody war ended, they were mercilessly cast out without means of subsistence, like an unnecessary tool. They could survive only by procuring food through dangerous hunting of the fiercest creatures of this world. However, one day, defending their hunting grounds from encroachments, they encountered the infamous ogre, Leon's father, and simultaneously the continent's chief killer, whose name was whispered with horror. Of course, the orcs fought with all their might for their lives in that fateful battle. However, to their misfortune, only a single fighter survived. And now he, the last of his kind, alone, bore the name that once proudly represented an entire mighty race of warriors. For many years after that bloody massacre, the survivor methodically scoured the remote forests in the kingdom of Armia. He clearly heard the ominous rumors about the offspring of his people's enemy, and was in agonizing anticipation of the day when the long-awaited revenge for the fallen brothers would be fulfilled. That is why now all the monsters attacked the hero so fiercely and fiercely, so as not to allow him to rest, even for a moment. Leon defended himself with the chosen spear as best as he could, putting all his strength into every strike. However, the monsters cleverly positioned themselves around him, attacking from all possible sides simultaneously, leaving no blind spots. In the end, a real, bloody massacre broke out, in which the young guy was forced to exert maximum effort to avoid completely losing the last remnants of his sanity. Many panicked, not understanding. What is so desperately pressing against some kind of semi-ogre? Looking at the whole happening slaughter, one could say they were only wasting their precious lives in this meat grinder. The archers continued to watch everything attentively from the height of the walls, but the captain simply did not know how to help the fighting young man in such a situation. Suddenly, one of the sharp-eyed archers noticed how the entire orc army was rapidly converging on Leon from all sides. He once offered to help the besieged fighter. It was clearly visible that despite all his superhuman strength, he was having an incredibly hard time against such a horde, mostly because of the treacherous orcish traps that repeatedly enveloped his body with spiked chains. In the moment when the hero was tied up again, the fighter Uluk himself swiftly leapt down on him from above with his formidable sword. He wanted to knock the opponent's head off with one crushing blow, ending it once and for all. However, since he deftly dodged at the last moment, he only managed to graze his shoulder with a glancing strike, and Leon, without much thought, immediately after that fiercely attacked in response, not allowing the enemy to approach him again with impunity. Thus, in a fit of rage, he tore off both of Uluk's hands right at the root, and he, like a madman, just kept laughing scornfully, as if his pain did not trouble him. Then the half-blood, unable to hold back, severed his body from his legs with one powerful swing, and the force of his strike was so great and destructive that the Uruk's body, like a weightless rag doll, immediately fell backward onto the blood-stained ground. It was clearly visible. Despite the fact that Uluk had irreversibly lost his limbs, he was sincerely satisfied with the work done. He saw that the time had finally come. His revenge was fulfilled just as he had dreamed. The one whom Leon had suppressed within himself for a very long time, with all his might, had finally awakened in all his beastly power. And in the end, all those who had carefully watched over the ogre throughout his life would soon witness his terrifying and true monstrous form. All that Uluk had strived for so persistently was for everyone to turn away from Leon and abandon him. And in the end, he was left completely alone, just as Uluk himself once was, because of the legendary Lobo who exterminated his people. In the end, the other orcs, realizing that their leader Uluk had already given his life for revenge, decided to hastily flee, understanding that without him, they would never defeat the enraged half-blood. Immediately after their inglorious flight, the villagers cautiously came out onto the battlefield. They began anxiously looking over their wounded comrades, desperately trying to bring them to consciousness after the brutal battle. Of course, they also hurried to Leon himself to check his condition after such an exhausting slaughter. The captain realized with relief Leon was alive. However, he was extremely surprised that he survived such an incredible number of attacks. They all became shocked witnesses to the countless blows and torn wounds inflicted on him by the orcs. And in that short time it took them to reach the lying Leon, many of his wounds had already managed to heal without a trace. So he really was a descendant of that very legendary ogre. However, the villagers were still worried. Would Leon cope with the treacherous poison that was generously smeared on the orcs' weapons? It was capable of killing even a mighty troll in minutes. There was much to ask the young man. However, the still-living Uluk hoarsely made it clear they did not need to wait until this monster woke from oblivion. They could ask all their questions to him, bleeding, lying here on the cold ground. Of course, the people were amazed that Uluk was still alive. and yet the captain had ordered to make sure that he had already left the world of the living forever. But the mutilated monster hurried to explain to the humans. He had already lost too much blood. His death was near and inevitable, so they could just interrogate him one last time. After all, he was no longer tied to this life. What was the point of hiding anything on the threshold of death? Of course, the warriors persistently asked that the captain not engage in dialogue with him at all. Uluk had managed to unite even the motley rabble of orcs. That meant he was extremely talented and dangerous. However, the captain was interested in that very letter that Uluk had sent by arrow. It was not written in the Orcish language. That meant the message was meant to be read by Leon himself, and no one else. But the commander was curious. Why was Uluk so hostile towards the boy? After all, in his short life, the young man had never left this forest. He could not have gone to the distant wastelands to offend this formidable orc in any way. Therefore, the captain was eager to know. For what reason exactly had Leon become their main target in this bloody attack? However, the injured Uluk only sneered contemptuously. He imagined how people would change their attitude towards Leon when everything became clear. But still, since his revenge had been fulfilled as planned, he generously decided to answer their question one last time. Apparently, miserable people thought they had securely hidden this half-blood from the world. But they were deeply mistaken in their naivety. They simply cowardly closed their ears and eyes to the truth and hid behind this impenetrable wall in the wilderness. Therefore, they simply did not know the greatest killer of the continent had gone on a rampage nearby again. The cause of his righteous anger was the awakened blue dragon that threatened the whole world. Of course, everyone who heard about this was terrified to madness, not understanding why the ancient dragon woke up right now at such a time. Moreover, everyone was well aware of the fierce nature of ogres. A typical adult specimen will resist until the very end, even if it inevitably means death. However, one day, a monster known as the greatest killer unexpectedly came to their walls in peace, as if tamed. It was precisely from this mysterious moment that Uluk's unquenchable obsession with revenge began. He found out that the reason why Lobo suddenly calmed down was some human woman. Uruk approached that village, following the scent. That very distinctive smell of the killer's blood was deeply imprinted in his memory forever. Therefore, Uluk felt that he had to find the half-blood at any cost. He gathered the orcs and methodically combed through the entire forest. He even created a perfect labyrinth of paths that outsiders simply could not pass through, and erected barriers in which they blindly wandered. Yet they could not change their bitter fate, and the reason was extremely simple. The forest where people settled originally belonged to Uluk himself as hunting grounds. However, he found it extremely amusing to watch how people remained ignorant and hid this half-blood, allowing him to grow and mature peacefully. The more the dying man spoke, the more the captain understood. Perhaps revenge for his people was not the main goal of the Uruk. Perhaps he simply wanted to make Leon an outcast, as he himself had been all his life. Lonely and rejected. Soon, when the wounded body finally healed thanks to regeneration, the young man began to slowly come to his senses. He woke up, alas, not at the most convenient moment, for at that moment, everyone gathered around the elder was tensely discussing Leon's fate. They perfectly understood. Although Leone had excellently trained the boy, giving him humanity, even his true beastly nature was not fully controllable. Leon could seem like a sociable and kind young man, but it was unknown when he would bring real trouble upon them by his very existence. Moreover, if he became more like a wild ogre, it was unlikely they could restrain him with their modest forces. Still, even Uluk and his organized army could not suppress the enraged Leon. Of course, thanks to him, the village managed to overcome this crisis and survive. However, if something went wrong in the future, the boy could turn against the very villagers. The captain bitterly declared, for the sake of protecting one child, the entire village risked the lives of all their families. However, suspecting that Leon had already awakened and was listening, the elder strictly ordered to immediately stop dwelling on this painful topic, for it would lead to nothing good. But the captain stubbornly would not give up. After failing to protect his own son from death, he simply could not lose an entire village because of someone else's child. He was fully aware the elder did not want to get rid of this child, but they urgently needed to take some measures. For if what Uluk said was true, very soon whole hordes of dragon hunters would come here for his soul. But the old man still stubbornly tried to calm the heated commander. Although they all shared his grief, the fate that befell poor Baxter did not concern the 13-year-old child. He was completely innocent of the nightmare that happened, and since Ken was one of the elders, he had to understand what was the priority for the whole village. However, he continued to insist persistently that they needed to take some decisive measures before it was too late. He shouted so loudly that the elder had to calm him down by force. Everyone was worried the boy might hear their harsh words. Leon himself, who had been pretending to be asleep all this time, perfectly understood that the incident was entirely his fault. Because he had lost control, the village council quarreled among themselves, and he bitterly wondered why everything had happened so tragically. Moreover, he could not understand why his father was exactly the great ogre, a legend of terror. He hated it with all his soul. At that moment, everyone finally realized that Leon had long been awake and was listening to them. Therefore, they hurried to him to help him get up. In the evening, after thanking for the caring treatment, the boy asked the old man not to worry about anything. After all, he was recovering quickly thanks to his nature, and was already on his feet, ready for anything. However, the old man was much more worried that they had told Leonia about what happened too late. Given the difficult circumstances, they simply did not have time to report the massacre to her. And moreover, the village elder reminded the boy, no matter what anyone said behind his back, he was the true savior of the village. The old man was very proud that they had such a mighty protector as him. After that, he kindly sent the youth home and asked him, upon arrival, to brew the healing herbs that were given to him, and to drink one portion with each meal for a speedy recovery. The hero sincerely thanked the old man once again and went on his way. His soul greatly hoped that all the wounded who remained inside would also recover and survive. Although the young man desperately tried to keep his composure, he clearly felt the heavy gazes directed at him from all sides. No one saw him as the former half-blood boy anymore. Everyone saw in him his father, the legendary Lobo, the continent's killer. Until the son returned home, Leonie anxiously stood outside the house late at night, waiting for his return and refreshing her head a little in the cool night air. Of course, when Leon saw her there, he was extremely frightened. He immediately ran to her, reminding his mother that going outside the house was dangerous, especially in the middle of the dead of night. However, Leonie sternly ordered her son to stop and calm down a little. After that, she made it clear she was fine, nothing to worry about. It was quiet around, but that was not the most important thing right now. When she fell silent, frozen like a statue, the boy became even more worried. Leonie wanted to discuss the fact that her son had decided to face the disaster that had befallen the village alone. Although she had warned him more than once, doing so was absolutely forbidden. However, she heard that kind Nelson tragically died beyond the barricade, and suspected. Because of this, her son's heart trembled and darkened, and in principle it was not far from the truth. When the half-blood recalled their old times together, Uncle constantly repeated he wished his own child were like Leon. At that very moment, the young man apologetically excused himself to his mother for making her so worried. However, the truth is, when he saw Uncle dying, he simply could not bear it. Mother knew perfectly well that Nelson was like a father to him. However, even when the man was on the brink of death, he still asked that the boy keep his wits no matter what. It seems he feared what Leon might face in the village, or the truth that this fateful day could reveal to him. Immediately after these painful words, old memories related to her kidnapper giant flashed rapidly through Leon's mind, and the boy pleaded that Mother finally tell him who was his father. Where did he get all this beastly nature and cursed power? However, The woman sharply asked her son to immediately stop talking about this painful topic. Immediately after this, she convulsively grabbed her head, barely holding back sobs, begging for forgiveness from him for her weakness, after which, due to the stress experienced, she began to rapidly lose consciousness. And Leon hastily caught her in his arms, not letting her fall to the cold ground. At this time, the events shift to the Kingdom of Serene. More precisely, to the lands of Baron Bills, who ruled his domains with an iron hand. The Baron was informed that the large-scale dragon hunt was suddenly interrupted without explanation. However, this sounded quite unrealistic for such an important event. However, the Baron himself always found it obvious. This hunt was a waste of precious resources and human lives. It seems everyone forgot why this hunt was ever forbidden in ancient times. All the time they babbled about traditions and honoring the wishes of ancestors. And no matter how much the Baron told them about this, the arrogant lords simply did not listen to him. Moreover, obviously, they could never compare to the true power of the sacred Helprine, no matter how hard they fought. And they only wasted their strength in this senseless endeavor. Therefore, the Baron still could not understand. What was the point of searching for the blue dragon in the darkness of the forests? Nevertheless, the knight perfectly understood. The sacred order to mobilize the kingdom's forces could not be ignored, but still, the Baron was extremely reluctant to give up his dear knight Herman, who had saved him from all sorts of troubles and intrigues more than once. The loyal knight himself promised his lord that he would do everything possible so that there would be no reasons for regrets on their native lands. They would diligently fulfill the obligations imposed on them by the crown, and if they demanded more sincerity and zeal from them, he would skillfully buy time for maneuver. However, as the Lord had predicted with his wisdom, many strange things happened on this hunt. So Herman was quite impressed by the foresight of his ruler. After all, the investigation really revealed interesting information about the half-blood, half-human, half-orc. The Baron suspected this from the very beginning and was glad. The money was not spent in vain, and the sacrifices they made on the altar of war would not be in vain. Immediately after that, the Baron sent his knight away from the chambers with a commanding gesture, and he, leaving, only maliciously promised his lord, "Wait a little longer, and very soon the proud head of Leon will join his luxurious trophy collection." After that, he put a hood on his head and went outside. There, Tilyuk was already patiently waiting for him with a grim face. However, as soon as the warrior saw the approaching knight Herman, he immediately asked him to stop at a distance. The whole reason was that it seemed the noble knight thought so highly of himself that he considered mercenaries to be some weaklings and obedient tools. But the mercenary still noticed that 3 armed warriors were trailing them closely. They could serve as both guards and spies at the same time. However, in either case, Tilyuk was categorically not satisfied. After all, they had agreed to keep the matter in the strictest secrecy. Herman immediately looked back, watching the people who were cautiously observing him from afar, and then he sternly scolded Tilyuk, because his insolent rudeness crossed all possible boundaries. He had to know his place in this world, and if he did not want to part with life before starting the work, it was better to keep silent. Tilyuk, hearing these arrogant words, understood. The knight considered himself strong enough to handle the task alone, but he reminded him their target was still, although a half-blood, a real ogre. Killing him in the forest was not as easy as it might seem. However, he did not care at all about difficult tasks. Only one thing mattered in his thoughts: the result at any cost. Somewhere at the same time, Leon was wandering through the dense forest and eventually skillfully climbed a tall tree. From there, he admired the mighty walls of the nearby city in the distance. The secrets that this city held obviously attracted the young half-blood monster with the unknown. However, there was no time to daydream. He needed to hunt for dinner, or it would soon get completely dark. Still, obviously, after the villagers rose against Leon, no one was eagerly waiting for him at home anymore. In the end, he rushed among the tall trees, and eventually caught up with a wild boar, fleeing in terror. The boar, almost crying from fear, rushed out of the forest until it reached the step zone, and Leon had already jumped down on it, recalling along the way. When did he learn to hunt so skillfully? It all happened as if by itself. His mother always carefully avoided this topic, and did not teach him anything animalistic, so that he would remain human at heart. Perhaps he hunted so incredibly skillfully only because the blood of his ogre father flowed in his veins. He grasped animal hunting methods incredibly easily and quickly, as if they were written in his nature. He intuitively knew how to deceive the prey, exhaust its strength, strike vital points when it least expected an attack. Probably, in this, he was very much like his father, whom he never knew, and, obviously, his mother was extremely frightened by the fact that there was something dark from his father, the killer in him. At the same time, the traitor Tilyuk, together with Hermann, set out into the Piran forest near the kingdom of Armia, following animal trails. However, the mercenary was genuinely surprised. After all, that time this forest was like a dangerous dungeon. Dozens of armed werewolves prowled around, and even 3 acted in coordinated unison against them. Hearing this, Hermann immediately assumed these creatures were specially trained in tactics, and he was absolutely right in his guess. According to Tilyuk, it turned out everything indicated that in the wilderness there was a real wave of races preparing for war. Of course, he might have slightly exaggerated what he said for dramatic effect. However, at that moment, something very much like an organized invasion was happening. Moreover, even in such a remote hole, there was a modest village where traders with goods used to stop by. However, recently there was a big commotion here with orcs. The raid was led by an Uruk from the wasteland of Trevelia. Hearing the name Uluk, Hermann immediately understood. This was a wandering mercenary of mixed races who during the racial wars led a whole squad of elite warriors. But he could not understand. Why would he have to travel such a long way precisely here, to this wilderness? However, it turned out, Tilyuk had also heard that for his bloody hunt for the monster, the Uruk had attracted quite a lot of a motley crowd. While they calmly conversed among themselves, they had almost reached the fortified walls of the village. At that time, the rest of Hermann's knights were following closely behind him, who were just killing the monsters they encountered, so that they would not dare to interfere with their lord's affairs. They were also interrogating the passers-by for information, but they told the same story that Tilyuk had told him earlier. In the end, they realized this mercenary was right in his words. Which means, among the monsters, there really was an unusual raid on the village. Uluk was persistently heading exactly to that village on purpose, which means their prey lived there, the half-blood ogre. Initially, the warriors were supposed to follow their lord to conduct a preliminary reconnaissance of the area. However, Hermann still gave them no signals. They suspected Hermann might have found a bigger and more interesting prey. In that case, all that remained for his loyal fighters was simply to obey the lord's order and wait. When the dead of night came, Leonie sat calmly in her house in complete solitude. She kept glancing anxiously out the window. However, her son did not return home from the hunt. She remembered the day when Leon spoke about his father with such pain. However, she could not say a single word in response. Still, everything related to Lobo continued to cause the former princess unbearable pain in her soul. However, suddenly, Tilyuk burst rudely into the house, kicking the door open and walking in without ceremony. He sarcastically apologized to the aristocrat for his rudeness. He had no idea that the noble but not particularly chaste lady was home alone at that time. Leonie herself was quite upset that this vile man had shown up uninvited in her house once again. She did not know why Tilyuk had come here again. But she warned. They were no longer connected to the village. Her son lived a peaceful life, far from intrigues. However, Tilyuk did not like at all the arrogant tone with which Leonie spoke to him. She was somehow not very friendly or polite, so he even mockingly suggested the noble lady preferred the company only the size of a deformed child. And he even began to cruelly mock her, thinking The aristocrat was worse than some port prostitute selling her body. After that, he mockingly bowed, as etiquette required, and properly introduced himself to the princess according to all the rules. Immediately after these words, behind his broad back appeared the knight Herman, who calmly looked at the lady with a cold gaze. He honestly admitted he did not expect to find her in such a filthy shed, unworthy of her status. He, more than anyone else, knew perfectly well to lead a miserable existence in such a place was unbefitting a true aristocrat of noble blood. After that, he politely introduced himself as Knight Herman from Sorain, who had traveled a long way to bring her back home to her family. Of course, the woman was extremely shocked by such an unexpected statement, and by the fact that Herman had traveled such an incredibly long way through the forests for this. She did not know how he found out where she had been all these years, but she explained that too much time had already passed since she was a princess living in the palace. Moreover, if the kingdom were still the same, wouldn't they have found her long ago? Given the complete lack of interest in her fate, only one thing could be assumed. They all died long ago. Herman, maintaining an unflappable calm, explained. Officially, the princess was declared dead. However, the kingdom did not fall. They still expected Leonie to return at any moment. The knight assumed that the woman had not returned for another reason. She surely believed that in her current situation, she simply would not be accepted back. However, the man understood. The princess had nothing to worry about. For her sake, he was ready to erase even the dirtiest blood. While they were talking, the knights scattered through the nearby forest. They knew perfectly well that their target usually wandered right here. According to rumors, the half-blood was essentially little different from a real ogre. Human habits, ability to communicate. All this did not change the fact that he remained a monster. Fortunately for the mercenaries, the creature looked nothing like a human. Moreover, Leon was quite a young individual by human standards. He was only 13 years old. However, the mercenaries were little interested in this fact. No matter how old this monster was, they were obliged to destroy it. Listening to the surrounding forest, the squad leader ordered to prepare weapons and line up. The ogre was about to appear any moment, and before Lord Herman's return, they absolutely had to achieve results. At that very moment, Leon was wandering through the forest, heading home. It was already quite late, and the pig he caught smelled terribly. His mother would definitely not like that. Although the woman tried not to show it, the young man really did not want to upset his mother. Lately, she had started frowning too often. Leonia did not tell what was wrong, even when her son directly asked her about it. The boy was convinced that her miserable mood was his fault, so he tried to do everything possible to finally lift his mother's spirits. However, unexpectedly, just as he tried to take a step toward home, the whistle of arrows sounded. A moment later, they rained down on his body, piercing the flesh. Without thinking long, the orc threw the pig carcass in the direction from which the cursed arrows were shot. But what worried him most was that some strange energy emanated from the shafts. Moreover, he did not feel the presence of strangers on his land. This could mean only one thing. The hunt had begun. All that was left for Leon was to scan the surroundings in search of those who attacked him. However, he had not managed to do anything when one of the swordsmen approached him closely, pointing the tip of the blade directly at his neck. Fortunately, the young man managed to deflect the attack, but he could not wound the opponent. The latter nimbly jumped back, and while Leon stood in confusion, another warrior attacked him from behind, stabbing a dagger into his back, trying to pierce through. The youth immediately fell to his knees, coughing up blood that flooded his throat. Unfortunately, he could not understand why they treated him this way, and why they wanted to kill him. After all, he lived quietly, kept a low profile, and yet they came for him again. Obviously, this slaughter was unfair, but Leon simply could no longer endure such attacks. At that very moment, Leonie was carefully observing the people who had come to her. It was obvious. Tilyuk was literally mocking Herman, although he tried to hide it. He believed that the knight was quite tired of living the life of a loyal dog to a corrupt official, so he clung to the missing princess as the last chance for salvation. Moreover, he took pleasure in watching the arrogant lady who literally shuddered at the warrior's words. He could not forgive her haughty look from above. Tilyuk wished for Herman to continue causing her pain with his words. After all, Leon in his miserable state could not resist. However, the woman calmly made it clear to those who came. She would not welcome with open arms those who came to shed blood. Immediately after these words, Leon silently burst into the room, raising his hands above the heads of these little men, looking at his huge palms, capable of crushing a skull like a nut. Herman had no idea how Ogru managed to escape from the clutches of his fighters. However, at the last moment, the trained knight managed to draw his blade and pointed it at the neck of the intruder. Moreover, with a smile, he decided to ask where he had learned such amusing techniques. Immediately after that, the man attacked, and the whole hut trembled from the power of the blow. Honestly, even the arrogant Tilyuk was amazed by the incredible strength of this knight. Now he understood why Herman's audacity knew no bounds. This guy had been hiding his true power all along, and Tilyuk could not even imagine that all this time he had been next to a true swordmaster. But what surprised the knight the most, despite the strength of the attack, the young man was not defending himself. With his body, he was shielding his own mother. Obviously, after what these insolent people had done to his home, the guy was barely holding back. But Leon called her son, explaining that these people would not harm her, but the boy should leave here quickly and hide. However, Herman did not let him escape and swiftly attacked with the energy of his sword. A deep wound immediately opened on the youth's back, and blood splattered everywhere, after which the warrior calmly warned the ogre that next time it would be better not to expect mercy. But before killing the monster, he wanted to hear the last excuse that would slip from his dirty lips. Only in this way could he clear the name of his pupils, for the man wanted to know how they were inferior to a mere beast. It turned out that when the knights put their swords to the boy's neck, they still could not kill him. In their lives, they had killed many, but killing the young was not to their liking. Of course, the comrades tried to explain to the knight that Leon was only slightly smaller than an adult ogre, and the youth himself did not even resist, understanding the futility of it. Unfortunately, he was unlucky to be born this way, for which he constantly paid. At the same time, the knight, raising his sword, explained to Leon, "The only reason for the existence of game is to be a target for hunting." However, to the misfortune of the warrior, he did not foresee that these words could provoke a huge enemy. The half-blood instantly moved behind his back and raised his hand to strike. The knight barely managed to defend himself with his sword. Soon it shattered into pieces, and the squad leader himself was thrown back, coughing up blood. Only then did the man realize the ogre had precisely anticipated his movements. Even a trained monster cannot have such maneuvers. Moreover, the creature should have been in a state of madness now, like any other ogre in a similar situation. However, it seems the substance they coated the arrows with did not work. Therefore, the warriors decided to try to finish him off before he fully recovered. However, no matter how hard they tried, the young man simply vanished into thin air, as if he had never been there. He finally understood. People see him as just a regular hunting target. He also realized that the needles that scratched him were poisoned. They wanted to turn him into a beast, so they could then hunt him like game. At the same time, the warriors looked around fearfully. They heard Leon's words coming from everywhere. It seemed the forest itself favored him and sheltered him in its shadows. The half-blood wanted to know, what had he done to these people? He had harmed no one, so being born this way was already a sin? And now the young man must accept it and condemn himself to death. Therefore, he was interested to find out how those beasts he had encountered before had died. Immediately after these words, he lunged at the leader, intending to grab him with his strong hands. However, in the end, the half-blood swiftly slipped past these people, leaving them alive. Only then did the warriors finally realize the ogre was exuding a hallucinogen from his skin and using it against them. It turned out that those who had organized the hunt became the prey themselves, and the most terrible thing was that even the strongest warrior of the squad could not touch a single hair on the youth's head. However, his colleagues considered something else more important. The smoke that masked the scent had dissipated, and this meant that the half-blood was heading straight to Lord Herman. Obviously, the warriors panicked, understanding this was the worst possible outcome. If such a monster attacked the master's trail, he would kill him without hesitation. However, in reality, the boy rushing to the house was simply trying to understand. Was he still a beast or a human? Did his origin matter? He had no idea what he was supposed to look like to have the right to live. In the end, realizing that even after a powerful strike of the sword's energy the youth was still conscious, Herman decided to stun him and then interrogate his students. He was simply curious to know the monster's view of the situation. That's all. After that, the warrior decided to kill Leon in front of his mother, for as is known, only with his own blood could the ogre cleanse her sin. Perhaps if the boy dies, the princess will finally abandon her foolish principles, and all the half-blood could say was to promise that Herman would not achieve his desire. In the end, the knight's attack was unsuccessful, causing him to hiss angrily, and Tilyuk was quite amazed at the cruelty of the warrior who intended to kill the child in front of his mother. So all that remained was to guess why everyone who possessed the aura of the blade was so merciless. In any case, the more important thing was that everything was going exactly according to plan. In the end, having taken the necklace from his mother, Leon escaped. Watching him flee, Herman took out his shortened spear, which had been resting in his bosom next to his sword all this time. He threw it after him, trying to pierce the fleeing beast. Obviously, the disciple saw Lord Herman's weapon, and this could mean only one thing. The cursed ogre had indeed angered him. It turns out that, although it was not quite fitting for knightly honor, Herman carried a spear for reasons of convenience. It is usually looked down upon, being called a weapon of commoners, but the Lord highly valued its usefulness in hunting. Moreover, his spear was specially modified. An aura ran under the channel, leading straight to the core. However, until now, the warrior had used the spear only in special circumstances. Now, having thrown this weapon, he gave his men an unambiguous signal. The warriors immediately set out. Surely the beast was already wounded, which meant there was only the matter of finishing it off. Of course, the knights were worried. Perhaps, due to their own carelessness, they could attract other predators to the site of the battle, which would add to their problems. However, for the leader of the squad himself, the appearance of monsters did not pose a serious threat. They should fear something entirely different. Knightly punishment was far more terrible than any beast. Therefore, in order to complete the mission as soon as possible and safely escape from the scene, they needed to hurry away. At that very moment, the half-blood hurriedly darted through the forest thickets. The young man was completely disoriented. His head was spinning unbearably, and his body seemed to move on its own, as if revealing the boy's true beastly nature. From his own hunting experience, the boy had perfectly learned one truth. Prey cornered inevitably attacks the hunter, especially when that hunter is a human. As a result, the spear that Herman threw still managed to hit Leon's target. It tore his travel bag and also inflicted a serious wound to his side. Therefore, falling from a great height, exceeding even the age-old trees, the half-blood crashed to the ground with a roar. At that very moment, the village elder was observing the events from the watchtower. Suddenly, the man noticed smoke was rising from Leon's house, clearly not from cooking. Perhaps something had happened to the woman. However, one of the young warriors reminded the captain's words. Considering Leon's origin, they could face serious trouble. Therefore, the commander recommended staying away from that place so the village would not suffer. The old man was shocked by the cowardice of these people, ready to stand aside when Leon and his son were under threat. He wished at least to check what was happening to them. However, the soldiers reasonably understood. Leon had her son, and even if he was unable to handle the situation, they certainly would not be able to help. The elder was deeply disappointed with these people insisting on inaction. It seemed their only priority now was to think about preserving their own heads. However, although they did not realize it, the threat to Leon's safety could turn into an even greater disaster for the village. But since no one intended to listen to him, the village head decided to go there himself. Obviously, Those who were concerned about the elderly man's condition could not leave him in trouble, so they decided to follow him. At that very moment, 3 of Hermann's disciples finally appeared before their mentor as reinforcements and immediately fell to their knees. The knight himself did not look pleased. Besides failing the mission, his men had also fallen several steps behind the target. The warriors had to admit it was entirely and completely their fault. However, for Hermann, such a confession looked like nothing more than a useless humiliation. Moreover, the squad leader tried to justify himself and his subordinates. Special vigilance was required in the battle with Leon. Ogres by their nature were brainless creatures, obeying instincts rather than thinking through strategy. But this monster definitely had human intelligence. Moreover, the creature considered itself a human. In the end, all that remained for the leader was, trembling with fear, to raise his hand before the Lord, for their hands obeyed his will. Hermann, however, decided to continue adhering to the principle of benefit. Therefore, he ordered the warrior to raise the hand in which he was not holding a sword, so that it could be cut off as punishment. However, at that very moment, they saw the village elder appear with 2 warriors behind him. Of course, Hermann secretly rejoiced. The bait had arrived just in time, according to their plan. The newcomers, naturally, were curious about what these knights were doing on Leonie's property. After that, they addressed the elder, since he looked as if he knew these people. The village head himself, at that moment, mentally transported himself to distant years. Then his son came to him, planning a rebellion against the Lord. The old man hurried to warn him that nothing good would come of it. It was no more effective than a child's tantrum. However, people could not accept the fact that taxes were raised up to 70%. If they continue to carelessly fill the ruler's pockets, everyone will simply starve to death. However, the old man felt this was not the only reason for the rebellion. The son began to behave strangely since the farmer's daughter was hanged in the square. The father knew the backstory perfectly. That farmer did not allow his children to be taken for servitude. At night, he preferred to engage in a fight when trying to escape, and the old man's son seemed to be in a relationship with his younger daughter. It was he who encouraged the girl to run away. Therefore, the father had to warn the son. The less strength a person has, the more dangerous it is to resist. However, he only calmly nodded and left, apologizing for his mistake. Nevertheless, the uprising against the Lord was far more brutal than they could have imagined. However, the ruler remained indifferent all the time, as if denying his involvement in the circumstances that had developed, and when the riot flared up seriously, he reacted in a manner befitting his position and dignity. This is how the first full-scale uprising on his lands ended in complete failure. The father could only helplessly watch as his son's body was hung in the square. The Lord did not even move regarding the situation of the old quartermaster, as if he absolutely did not care about him. However, the latter, worried that he might endanger the lives of others, fled from Sarain, for there reigned an unforgettable horror. There appeared a knight who in 3 days destroyed 400 soldiers without a single scratch on himself. And that soldier was Hermann. Obviously, seeing the elder's stupor, his assistants tried to bring the man to his senses in order to question him about everything. However, in the end, the people standing on both sides of him were mortally wounded in an instant, and one of them even fell at the old man's feet. The survivor could only scream and demand that the knight step back. Moreover, the village head could not even move toward them. 2 swords were already pointed at his neck. Hermann asked the old man not to be angry, for the committed murder was merely retribution. In the presence of a knight, one must observe manners. Besides, the warrior decided to give the elderly man every opportunity to atone for his guilt, for it was obvious he should not try to worsen an already difficult situation. Somewhere at that very time, the wounded half-blood continued to lie on the ground, while his injuries healed on their own. With each second, he increasingly realized what his sin of birth consisted of. The young man even thought it would be much better to simply accept it and die peacefully. He had no idea what form he should take just to continue living calmly. At that moment, many monsters gathered around the exhausted body of the ogre, surrounding him from all sides. Then Leon remembered his mother's stories, who explained, although ogres have long inhabited the earth, they were very little studied. For some mysterious reason, although these creatures were endowed with exceptional agility and strength, ogres preferred to act independently, relying only on themselves. However, originally they were born to dominate all the inhabitants of the forest, and now the half-blood realized this when the monsters that approached him carefully surrounded him as if guarding him, and the werewolves began to lick his wounds with their healing saliva. When Leon felt better, he immediately got up and roared loudly, and the other beasts responded to his call. The young man now perfectly understood why his mother considered the nature of ogres an inexplicable paradox. However, this very paradox was perhaps the only chance to save the life of his mother and the entire village. At that moment, the observer from the watchtower saw Herman leading an old man, his bait. Immediately after this, the knight drew his sword and easily cut his way through the heavy logs, using the energy of the blade. Everyone, of course, panicked and suggested to the captain to attack, not allowing the warrior to reach them. However, he understood the futility of such actions. The one who came to them could definitely finish them all off in a couple of strikes. He deliberately struck weaker. It was a warning for them to surrender. Therefore, it was better for them not to provoke him now. They had to appease the knight at all costs. However, suddenly below, the captain finally spotted the village elder, who was being led by the newcomers. Naturally, the commander immediately decided that the fools had sent the village head all the way to Leon's house alone. However, when he was explained that an armed guard and a private soldier had accompanied the elderly man, he was surprised. Why were they not with him now? He instantly ordered his scouts to follow the tracks of those who had left. They had to find the escort, while the captain tried to buy time. Of course, the warriors tried to warn the commander that it was dangerous to deal with this matter alone. However, he ordered the remaining warrior, in case of an unforeseen situation, to evacuate the villagers through the underground tunnels, because if this was the very person he thought of, then the lives of the people were in great danger. At that moment, waiting for someone to come down to him, Herman calmly reflected on his own life. He perfectly understood. Everything in this world is subject to someone's will. However, he did not understand. Why then seek any boundaries or benefit? Then the Baron explained. Even Herman himself rose from the very bottom, not only thanks to his own desire. Of course, no one underestimated his efforts and hardships. However, given the circumstances, few needed a knight of ignoble origin. Therefore, the warrior had to accept that he could not break through by force alone and focus on advantage. At that very moment, the captain who had come out immediately fired a shot, from which, obviously, Herman easily dodged. However, the knight considered it the greeting that this man deserved. As far as experience told the captain, the noble warriors were simply unfamiliar with the human language. However, Herman quickly realized this man is merely trying to buy time, and he decided to make him understand that his plan would not work. Immediately after that, the warrior attacked with the energy of his sword, like a laser beam, and ultimately cut off his opponent's arm. The frightened elder began to sob, begging to punish only him alone. After all, he was the head of the village, and his people knew nothing and understood nothing. Obviously, one elder was quite enough to get what was necessary for the knight. However, the knight only became even more furious at such audacity and attacked the one standing ahead. In the end, despite all the fury of the attacks, the blows were only warning shots. They struck right behind the captain, causing deafening, thunderous explosions that made the very earth tremble. The man himself, scared half to death, helplessly fell to his knees, simultaneously losing consciousness from rapid blood loss. His wounded arm was bleeding profusely. Having vented his passion a little and cooled down from righteous anger, Herman cold-bloodedly explained to the old man. He would have to try very hard to satisfy the knight's demands. The warrior had to properly anger his prey, to ignite its rage to the limit. So the knight longed to thoroughly slash the entire village to ashes, so that even the surrounding forest would be soaked with the thick, suffocating smell of blood and death. Obviously, when Herman's pupils rushed behind Ken into the village, Leon swiftly came to the defense of the defenseless village again, skillfully deflecting the attacks of the charging fighters, and joyful Herman was eagerly expecting just that, immediately pouncing on the young ogre like a predatory beast on its prey. And he did not forget to sarcastically reproach the youth for abandoning his own mother to fate, leaving her defenseless. However many terrible destructions the warrior sowed around, he did not manage even partially to touch the nimble opponent, which, of course, greatly wounded the proud knight's pride. So the enraged warrior sternly ordered the miserable monster to immediately stop boldly ignoring his will and challenge. After that, the hero continued swiftly circling around Herman in wide circles, skillfully forcing him to lose vigilance and attack everything around, though completely unsuccessfully. Because the knight was so furiously fixated on catching the elusive monster, he simply did not notice how werewolves silently crept up to him from the darkest depths of the dense forest. In the end, the hungry monsters immediately sank their sharp fangs into both his hands, biting tightly and painfully down to the bone. Another beast immediately joined these two predators, ready to aim straight for the victim's unprotected neck. At that very moment, Herman's subordinates were also enduring considerable discomfort. Right next to them was the main hero himself, and the thick clouds of smoke swirling in the air thoroughly blocked the warrior's view. These suffocating clouds were poisonous vapors from the bleeding wound of the monster, generously mixed with the previous narcotic potion. So the situation was truly sad, no better than that of their commander. However, when the alarmed trio turned back, they saw with horror a gruesome scene. The monster werewolves were already devouring their unfortunate friend by the bloody parts. These were ruthless scavenger wolves, showing no mercy, so as soon as the hungry predators dealt with their prey, the animals immediately targeted the next catch without delay, and Leon had to help them in every possible way, distracting his enemies and allowing the wolves to sneak closer unnoticed while they fended off his furious attacks. Obviously, the experienced knight immediately recognized the same attack pattern that was in the forest when Leon played bloody games with the soldiers, so the knight was even quite disappointed by the predictability of the enemy, until another hungry wolf bit into his leg with a death grip and dragged him back like a rag doll. While the warrior was successfully fending off one fierce predator, another beast silently crept up from behind and, with a lunge, bit into his arm, completely immobilizing the enemy with an iron grip. And this brief moment was more than enough for Leon to swiftly sneak up on the man from the impenetrable darkness. In the end, the young ogre grabbed the knight by the throat with mighty strength, lifting him high above the ground as if he were a weightless toy. However, it seems the proud knight was not afraid of inevitable death at all. He just wanted to know why the hero last time simply beat him half to death, but did not kill him then. Perhaps this idealist was just trying to prove that he was fundamentally different from the inhuman, bloodthirsty monsters. But it was not the ogre who ended the life of this warrior with a single precise blow. It was his own commander in desperate attempts to attack the elusive enemy. Now, when the opponents were left one-on-one without witnesses, Leon immediately rushed forward swiftly to finally deal with this scoundrel. However, he still managed, with an accurate strike, to hit the young monster's weak spot, causing his barely healed wound to start bleeding profusely again, staining the ground crimson. The warrior himself furiously resented this pathetic hybrid, who clearly had no idea who the real knights of the continent were. So Herman decided to personally teach him an important lesson in the only language the monster understood, the language of strength and blood. At that very moment, in a modest hut, Leone was left alone with the cunning Tilyuk, who could barely contain his malicious laughter. In the end, obeying the order of his devoted mommy, the obedient monster ran away without looking back. He really was a very submissive son who obeyed his mother. Moreover, the guest saw that Leone was clearly trembling with fear, although she desperately tried not to show it, keeping a proud face. Therefore, the cunning man did not understand why she was creating all this brave illusion around herself and pretending to be fearless. However, the former princess explained to the uninvited guest as calmly as the circumstances allowed. The sacred duty of a mother is to protect her child at any cost. And if she has anything to worry about in this cruel world, it is exclusively about the future of her child. Therefore, she decided to ask directly again, what exactly does she need to do so that these people leave her son alone and no longer pursue him? However, Tilyuk barely restrained himself from laughing out loud at the absurdity of the situation. He simply did not understand how a lady who once lived serenely in luxury, being a noble aristocrat of a great country, could fall so low and descend to such a miserable existence. However, unfortunately, these two did not have as much time as they would have liked, because at any moment either monsters or knights could return. So Tilyuk decided not to waste precious time and get down to business. He honestly admitted to the woman's face that what annoyed him most in the world was precisely her disgusting, monstrous offspring. Therefore, the cunning man longed for this fallen harlot to show him her former stubbornness and pride one last time, because no matter how much she now justified herself and humiliated herself, on that distant day, she looked down on him as a truly miserable outcast of society. However, at this tense moment, as if out of nowhere, right behind the defenseless princess, there was a powerful surge of magical mana. A glowing portal formed, from which a mysterious warrior swiftly emerged. The newcomer instantly struck the unsuspecting enemy with his blade, while Tilyuk's body slowly fell apart into bloody pieces. The unfortunate man had no idea where this powerful warrior from distant Pensalota had come from in such a remote wilderness, forgotten by the gods. The bloody fight between Leon and Herman was at its most furious peak, not subsiding for a moment. However, having fallen once into the enemy's trap, the young ogre now skillfully dodged all deadly blows like a ghost. But Herman was furious to the limit, not understanding how long this pathetic hybrid would keep leading him by the nose and cowardly running away, tail tucked like a beaten dog. In the end, the youth deliberately took one of the swift attacks on his arm, sacrificing it. Then, with mighty force, he struck the enraged Herman, aiming precisely at his chest area. Despite the knight desperately trying to defend himself with his faithful sword, with all his might, even his sturdy armor began to come off his body from the monstrous force of the blow, and his clothes tore to shreds. Though he managed to stay on his feet, not collapsing to the ground. However, the struck Herman was quite shaken by the fact that stopping just this one blow required so much strength from him. In the end, out of respect for a worthy opponent, the noble knight decided to give the youth wise advice. He should finally choose who he wants to be, a ruthless hunter or a pathetic prey. Otherwise, this senseless fight will last endlessly until one of them falls from exhaustion. However, at that moment, a huge troll suddenly appeared on the battlefield, the very beast that obeyed the forest bark. Obviously, for the experienced knight, fighting trolls was a familiar matter, routine. So he immediately surrounded the monster with magical blades from all possible sides, leaving no chance for escape. As a result, the monster's mighty body was so severely mangled by merciless blows that even while it still stood on its feet with the last of its strength, a real rain of its hot blood was already pouring abundantly onto the cracked earth. But the knight raged furiously, not understanding why Leon still boldly considered him some pathetic weakling, unworthy of respect. The young ogre himself was quite impressed by the fact that the knight, barely standing on his feet, dealt with his cunning trap so easily. This meant only one thing. The knights of the continent really were different from ordinary soldiers. After that, the deadly fight between these two worthy opponents continued with doubled fierce intensity. After all, a noble knight could not forgive that some pathetic half-blood dared to contradict him so boldly. He absolutely had to show this degenerate from the cursed Truelian lands, his rightful place in the food chain. In the end, he managed, with an unexpected lightning-fast strike, to plunge his trusty sword deep into the youth's body. The triumphant Herman celebrated, understanding that at last this arrogant monster would feel on its own skin what true submission to power means. However, the proud knight was so carried away by his victory that he missed the most obvious counterattack that fell upon his head. In the end, the entire surrounding forest near the village turned into a real bloody massacre worthy of epic legends. The worried old man took care of the wounded residents, desperately trying to somehow help the unfortunate in these modest conditions. And finally, the long-awaited bright sun rose above the horizon. And with this solemn sunrise, Leon managed to completely defeat his formidable enemy. However, the dying Herman, until his very last breath, considered the Trouville merely stupid, bloodthirsty monsters. Not understanding how such miserable freaks dared to attack the noble knights of the continent, Leon himself was no longer afraid of such empty threats. After all, since he had already managed to defeat one powerful knight, he would definitely be able to do it again if necessary. Moreover, judging by the obsession that Herman possessed, it gave a clear impression that he himself was from the Trouville-cursed lands, even though he denied it. However, before saying goodbye to the enemy forever, Leon made it clear he did not want all this bloodshed at all. The young ogre simply longed to live peacefully in the world without disturbing anyone. Using this confession as a last chance, the dying Herman made a desperate attempt to strike the head of the degenerate, who has no idea what torments and trials he had to endure to climb so high on the social ladder. However, obviously, he was no longer able to do anything and could not realize his plan. After all, when your head is firmly held in the monstrous hands of the enemy, you should not make any reckless moves. Soon, Leonie was finally able to barely get out of the destroyed house. Leaning on her homemade crutch, she felt with all her motherly heart that her son was somewhere very close, so she became alert and anxiously waited for him. And indeed, very soon the young man came out from the opposite side of the destroyed house, cautiously looking back at his dear mother. Leonie was clearly very angry and upset that her son still fought the knights, although she had strictly ordered him to run away and hide. However, Leon simply had no other choice, because cruel people wanted to use the innocent villagers as live bait for a trap. However, the woman could not calm down and was outraged, because her only son could seriously suffer or even die as a result of the bloody battle. She could not accept that he wanted to save the village at the cost of his own precious life, especially considering the fact that the villagers had once already treacherously turned away from him. However, the ogre was simply sincerely grateful to these simple people for the fact that, when they desperately needed help and a roof over their heads, they generously agreed to shelter them. However, Leonie still stubbornly considered this an insufficiently weighty reason to give her own life for them. Moreover, she perfectly understood. After everything that had happened, they would probably no longer be allowed to even stay near the village. They would be driven away, and to be honest, at first Leon was even a little frightened by these harsh words, feeling a chill in his chest. However, recalling the eloquent looks of the elder and the captain at that tense moment, he perfectly understood. His mother was absolutely right in her grim predictions. Moreover, as he had already realized from his own experience, to survive in this world, it was definitely better for him to listen to his mother's words. After that, the worried young man decided to cautiously find out if his mother was all right, if she had not been hurt. And where had that nasty man named Tilyuk gone? The worried Leonie hurried to calm her son, explaining that Tilyuk, having not waited for the knight's return, simply left. The caring mother just did not want to unnecessarily upset her son, who already looked terribly exhausted. He desperately needed to rest properly and heal his wounds. Therefore, the young man immediately went to the ruined house to get some sleep and regain strength. However, first, the the caring son decided to carefully prepare a comfortable place for his mother to rest. However, before leaving, the young man confessed to his mother. He longed to continue living with her, no matter what. Therefore, the son pleaded that she never again ask him to run away and leave her alone. And of course, like any loving mother, Leonie found it unbearably sad to hear these painful words from her own child. Soon, when the ruined house returned to relative normalcy after the rampage, the caring Leonie gently laid her son in bed and sat beside him, like with a small child. However, obviously, after all the nightmare endured, despite his impressive age and power, Leona was tormented by terrible, bloody nightmares that gave him no peace. At the same time, Leonie herself continued to thoughtfully examine the mysterious amulet with a bright green stone inside, before carefully placing it in her secret pocket. At the same time, in the village of Peruan, a solemn burning of the bodies of those who died as a result of a brutal nightly attack was taking place. After the sad ceremony, the distraught village elder sat down in his modest office, heavily thinking about what they should do next. Last time, when fierce orcs attacked the defenseless village, the captain did not blame Leona for the tragic death of his only son. However, now they simply had no solid guarantee that all this bloodshed would not happen again, even more terrible. Still, the elder, like no one else, knew perfectly well what a dangerous world they lived in, and how powerful the royal knights of the continent were. At this tense moment, suddenly, a knight appeared to the elder through a portal, indicating that what the worried old man feared had indeed happened. Of course, the elder was quite surprised that Kuzlan had secretly been watching them all this time. However, the noble knight himself bitterly reminded him that he had warned the old man more than once that this fateful day would surely come. Over the past 14 years, there had been many dangerous situations and near failures, but this was an exceptional case. Leona had contacted the royal knight openly for the first time. Now the guard could no longer guarantee the princess's absolute safety as before. The very worried elder was extremely interested to find out. Were there any witnesses to the bloodshed? And where had that nasty bearded mercenary named Tilyuk gone? When he learned that Kuzlan had settled everything, he hurried to explain. He had reliable, trusted people who knew how to keep their mouths shut. However, the elder understood. Since Kuzlan had resolved the issues with Tilyuk, he had surely also contacted Princess Leonie herself. At that very moment, by the dim light of a faintly flickering candle, Leonie was writing a touching letter. She put her amulet into it as a keepsake and cried bitterly, unable to hold back her tears. Events are rapidly moving to the army, more precisely, straight to the front line, where the village had just arrived, riding his faithful black horse. The royal knights whispered to each other in surprise. After all, a powerful knight from distant Pensalota had unexpectedly appeared and announced that the elder from some shabby village would soon arrive. Looking around cautiously, the alarmed old man also noticed familiar faces. For example, Bexter, who stood next to the formidable mercenary leader Kincaid. The leader himself was indignant. After all, the knights of the great nation were quite unpredictable in their actions. Sometimes they suddenly appeared in the east, sometimes in the west, like ghosts. However, he perfectly understood he and the village elder were now in the same boat, bound by a common misfortune. They were both deeply indebted to these knights of Pensalota, because both had once fallen for their cunning tricks. After that, the stern mercenary demanded that the old man immediately lead them to the lair of the talking monster. By this time, about half a year had passed since the brutal attack by the knights, and all communication with the remote village had been completely cut off. After that fateful incident, the main character's house stood ruined, like a monument to tragedy. However, what worried Leon the most was the depressing condition of his dear mother, who was rapidly wasting away before his eyes, fading with each day. He simply did not know what to do, how to help her. After all, harsh winter was coming soon, and he couldn't even comfort her properly, unable to find the right words. However, to avoid troubling thoughts and to distract himself, the young man decided to find firewood for the hearth. Suddenly, he heard a loud cry from a monster, who was very frightened and was calling for help. Leon immediately understood. One of the forest monsters was threatened by a man, and it was desperately roaring, trying to somehow free itself from the iron grip of the enemy. However, to his great regret, the ruthless mercenary leader was much stronger than the mighty troll. So he mortally wounded the beast, then cold-bloodedly killed it without flinching. However, the warrior was extremely disappointed by the cowardly behavior of the so-called king of the forest. After all, he had tortured this poor troll so long and cruelly in front of everyone, and the very lord did not even come here to help his subordinate. After that, the mercenary turned to the old man, who had seen the young ogre's abilities with his own eyes. For a monster who had subdued other forest creatures and even defeated royal knights in battle, he acted too cautiously and timidly. Therefore, the experienced knight even thought that perhaps this ogre had decided to mercifully spare them, showing mercy. However, the distressed old man understood. Perhaps the true reason lay in himself, although he was not completely sure of this. After all, they had long since had no contact with his family. However, Leon's voice suddenly arose as if from nowhere when he calmly explained to the uninvited guests he had not attacked them yet, but was only warning them. The young man apologized if the trolls had caused them any serious harm, but explained they were just patrolling their territory, guarding the borders. Leon himself did not intend to harm people intentionally, so he asked the people to leave peacefully. Still, for some time, he and his mother would prefer to simply stay in the shadows, not attracting attention. However, the stern mercenary coldly made the speaking ogre understand that he was very cruelly mistaken in his assumptions. After all, he came here not for peaceful negotiations. He was here to call the monster to a harsh account for what was done, not to appease it with empty words. And if the ogre refused to cooperate, he would have to go to his mother. Obviously, this direct threat could simply not be ignored. Therefore, immediately descending swiftly from the tall tree, the enraged Leon mercilessly attacked the knight, throwing the warriors away with a powerful blow. The worried elder, of course, desperately asked Leon to calm down and not kill. After all, this mercenary was still an ordinary person, not a monster. However, Leon calmly reminded, many warriors, including Dexter, died in that battle, and Uncle Ken was seriously wounded and barely survived. Fearing new misfortunes and casualties, the villagers asked him to stay away from people, which he obediently did, admitting his guilt. He perfectly understood that the blame for the bloodshed lay with him, so he submitted to their will without protest. However, his own departure would have been quite enough for everyone. But even his own mother followed him into exile at the cost of her own safety and comfort. So obviously, in such a case, for a devoted son, there was nothing more important than his beloved mother. And the elder, fully aware of all this, still dared to bring his enemy here. In this tense moment, distracting Leon from his angry speeches, the mercenary swiftly threw a heavy sword at his head, which obviously the guy deflected with astonishing ease with one hand. Therefore, the mercenary had to explain. He attacked not with the intent to kill, but if he had struck with full force, he could have left the youth crippled for life. But still, the warrior was sincerely grateful that he had generously spent on expensive armor and equipment. After all, the ogre was incredibly strong. One of his attacks could easily pierce any weaker armor. The mercenary politely asked the speaking ogre to talk calmly with him for a moment, hoping that he was inclined towards a constructive dialogue. After all, the mercenary came here to ask whether the boy was acquainted with a man named Tilyuk. He was a mercenary from the chief's squad who volunteered to accompany the royal knights on the hunt. However, later he was found cold-bloodedly killed by another mysterious knight, some stranger, not from Solrain. And just before that, a message arrived that before his death, Tilyuk was with his own mother. Therefore, the mercenary came to find out from Leon whether Leone told him about that mysterious knight who committed this murder, or about what happened that night. And if she deliberately concealed what happened, he wanted to know. Was Leon aware of the true reasons for this lie? Leonie herself at that very time was sitting, thoughtfully reading a worn-out book at her modest desk. However, she still involuntarily recalled that fateful moment when the loyal knight of the kingdom of Kuslan came to save her from death. But, trying to distract herself from painful memories, she looked out the dusty window in anxious anticipation of her son, who still had not returned home. However, as if sensing something was wrong with a mother's heart, she decided to immediately go out and see what had happened. At that very moment, Leon brought the village elder, along with the formidable leader of the mercenaries, to his home. Then the worried mother left the house to understand what had happened. Leon anxiously asked her not to go anywhere, for it was too dangerous for her. However, Leonie authoritatively ordered her son to stop immediately, and he immediately froze in place, not taking a step forward, as if petrified. The mercenary, carefully looking around the modest house, realized the royal knights had not lied to him. The strangest things were indeed hidden in this house, and it seemed even a half-orc would not compare to these astonishing oddities. Until today, everyone considered the princess long dead, but there were persistent rumors claiming the opposite. Leonie, seeing no point in hiding the obvious, honestly admitted she had been alive all this time, although her appearance was no longer what it once was. She also knew who was spreading rumors about her, and assumed that sooner or later she would inevitably meet this person. It seemed only the frightened Leon did not understand what his mother was speaking about so mysteriously. The mercenary decided not to ask in detail how all this had happened. After all, he himself had once fallen for cunning tricks. But the mercenary had to fulfill his duty at any cost. At the same time, the boy was desperately panicking, not understanding why his mother deliberately hid the information about Tilyuk's death, about the fact that she was a princess of a great kingdom. For it seemed unshakable to him that his mother had no one dearer than him in this world. Of course, Leonie immediately authoritatively ordered her son to calm down and pull himself together. However, he could not do this. The young man simply screamed in despair, not understanding why his mother had been silent for so long and quietly suffering because she had to lie to him. He had already been told Tilyuk, who burst into their house, was killed by a knight's sword, but not by the hand of Hermann, whom the boy himself killed. Apparently, someone external could simply not be involved here. Therefore, it was that mysterious person who was somehow already connected to his mother. Then, returning home among the debris after the battle, he felt some strange, anxious aura in the air. However, he decided not to give it much importance at that time, but still, he was bitterly disappointed by the thought that he had remained completely unaware of his mother's past for so many years. However, the mother was eager to know. About what debt was their uninvited guest speaking now? Therefore, the boy had to explain. He wanted the hero to take responsibility for what happened and honestly pay for the death of his mercenary. Leon had to take the place of the deceased, and only then could he repay his heavy debt. However, obviously, Leonie did not consider this payment fair or sufficient. Tilyuk was a miserable scoundrel who threatened a defenseless, mutilated woman, and he got what he deserved. That was quite enough to reject his demands. Moreover, she was amazed. The son did not even think to resist. For example, to use force or run away. However, the village chief demanded that Leonie immediately stop worsening an already difficult situation. It is well known that Kincaid painfully experiences the loss of his mercenaries as if they were his own children, which means Leon will serve even more reliably than ordinary conscripts, even on the field of bloody battle, and then they will again be able to guarantee the woman absolute safety. She cannot live like this forever, in constant fear and isolation. However, Leonie did not want the village elder to worry so much about her. She perfectly understood his sincere desire to protect the village at any cost. Therefore, There was no need to waste precious strength on her. Unworthy. After all, the final decision will remain only with her only son. Therefore, she longed to know. What does he himself want? What will his heart say? The events rapidly move 5 days later, to the Rocky Mountains of Trevelya. The experienced man hastened to explain. That place only at first glance seemed like lifeless ruins, but it was here that the Knight Pensalota, the very mysterious warrior who had guarded Leon's mother all this long time, cast a powerful teleportation spell. Therefore, in this magical place, the young man could instantly transfer to the front line to the army, and immediately upon arrival, he would be officially considered a mercenary. Of course, the captain warned. Because of the frightening appearance, at first the boy would be treated with great suspicion and fear. But as soon as he shows Kincaid's sign, a man will appear, whom the leader appointed as commander. Thanking for the detailed explanation, Leon became worried that the gentleman would not go with him on the journey. After all, the supplies were almost completely finished, barely enough for 2. And honestly, the mercenary was even surprised. The young man who left his native home was captured, still continued to care about others. This guy was starting to please him more and more, arousing respect. Therefore, he explained, he had already arranged a meeting with the Royal Knight in advance. He needed to collect the payment for delivering the hero safe and sound, as promised. He promised that they would definitely meet again soon. But it was unlikely there would be a chance to talk calmly like this alone. Therefore, he decided to find out at the last moment why Leon, who could kill him with one crushing blow, did not do it, and even allowed himself to be taken away, taken from the defenseless mother. However, the reason was extremely simple. The boy's mother never wanted him to become a heartless monster. Therefore, if the young man, despite his frightening appearance, still manages to defeat fate, then he will be able to be with his mother again. This honest answer seemed very interesting and profound to the mercenary. After all, for a person who goes to the field of bloody slaughter, where people turn into soulless monsters, Leon had truly impressive endurance and willpower. After that, the mercenary pointed to a tall flagpole near which there was an ancient teleportation spell. Finally, the time had come for the guy to set off on a dangerous journey. And as soon as he decisively entered the building, it immediately shone with a dazzling bright light, instantly sending him to the front line. Panic broke out in the mercenary camp. Of course, all the mercenaries were immediately seriously frightened when they saw a real ogre suddenly appeared near their tent, and at that moment, Baxter was hastily called, who was the commander of the advanced squad, to deal with this trouble.